welcome back to tonight's journey. Tonight we travel to a story older than human memory, older than the names of the gods, older than the very idea of order itself. Tonight we return to a time when the sky did not yet know where to stand, when the earth had not learned how to bear weight, when power had no throne, and violence had no history to justify itself. This is not a story about perfect heroes, nor is it a tale of good and evil in any simple sense. This is a story of succession, of fathers who fear being replaced, of mothers who carry the whole world within them and are turned into prisons for their own children, and of children who grow up in darkness to learn how to change the order of light. If you'd like, leave a comment below telling us where you're listening from and what time it is where you are right now. And now take a slow breath and let this story pass through you like an ancient river. Before Olympus there was a war, and it began not with thunder, but with silence. Before anything existed clearly enough to be named, before light learned how to separate itself from darkness, before darkness understood that it could exist without needing light to justify it, the world existed in a state that humans much later, lacking a language precise enough, would describe with a single word: chaos. But chaos was not the disorder of fragments colliding. It was not the screaming confusion of matter awaiting arrangement. It was not a storm without a center. Chaos was a space that had never been questioned. There was no above or below to compare, no boundary to cross, no center to orbit, and no edge from which one could fall. Time did not yet know what it was not because it was weak, but because there was nothing enduring enough to force it into measurement. It did not flow because there was no beginning from which to depart. It did not stop because no moment yet mattered enough to be held. It did not repeat because no memory existed dense enough to be called before. Time did not take the shape of a river, nor did it resemble a circle. It did not move from past to future, nor turn back upon itself like a wheel. It simply existed, like the breath of a being that does not yet know. It will one day need to breathe a vague motion without rhythm, just enough to keep the possibility of existence open. If someone had stood within that time, they would not have sensed before or after, because no event yet existed clearly enough to divide the world into sequence. There was no moment, no waiting, no urgency, only a strange sensation everything could happen. Yet there was no reason for anything to happen now. Time did not push. It did not apply pressure. It did not demand. It did not ask when, because the question itself had no meaning. It was like a door not yet opened, but not yet locked, a door existing, not to lead somewhere, but to preserve the possibility that one day there might be somewhere to go. Space existed in the same condition. It had not yet learned how to hold form, because nothing existed stable enough to force it to do so. It was not wide, because there was nothing to contain. Not narrow, because nothing sought escape. Not deep, because nothing had fallen. Not shallow, because no surface yet existed to be measured. Space did not open outward in every direction. Rather, all directions existed at once, layered, intersecting, overlapping without collision, like possibilities that had never been chosen. There was no east or west, no high or low, because such concepts require reference points, and at that time, nothing existed firm enough to serve as one. If time was possibility without rhythm, space was possibility without shape. It was not an empty void, but a completely open condition, where every form could arise, yet no form was strong enough to declare itself correct. Space did not contain chaos. Chaos did not exist within space. The two overlapped like questions never asked, and therefore never requiring answers. In that condition, existence did not need to justify itself, because there was no observer standing outside it to question it. There was no observer, and therefore no distance between the act of seeing and the thing seen. Time and space had not yet separated into two things. They were entwined like a thought before language, like motion before naming. Only when something began to hold its place did space learn how to gather around it. Only when something extended its presence did time learn how to move. But before that moment, everything rested in a balance, not of order, but of non-choice. A world where every path existed, yet none had been walked, not for lack of courage, but for lack of feet. Space led nowhere because there was no destination. Time carried no one because no one yet needed to be carried. If any sensation governed that state, it was neither peace nor chaos. It was unformedness, a silence not enforced, but unbroken, because nothing yet required breaking it. And within that silence, where time carried no burden of passage and space bore no responsibility of support, a crucial condition emerged, the possibility for something to appear and remain. When Gaia appeared, space learned for the first time how to hold. When Gaia spread time, learned for the first time how to slow itself around weight. From that moment onward, time was no longer merely potential. Space was no longer merely open. They began to carry meaning. But that belongs to later chapters. Before Earth could be heavy, before sky could be high time, and space had once existed as two questions never asked, and therefore never painful. Within that chaos, no god stood guard because nothing yet required protection, and no fear existed sharp enough to summon power. Then, within that nameless stillness, not a burst, not a command, not a will imposed from beyond, but a movement so slow that even if someone had been watching, they would not know whether it was truly happening. Chaos began to thicken, like water gathering beneath frozen ground before winter has fully released its hold, not melting, not flowing, yet already knowing it will not remain there forever. That thickening had no clear form, no boundary, yet it carried a distinct sensation, weight. And from that weight Gaia emerged. No one gave birth to her, because at that moment the concept of birth did not yet exist. Gaia was not a being entering the world. Gaia was the world entering itself. She did not rise. She did not open her eyes. She did not speak. She spread, a presence, heavy, slow, enduring, laying itself across existence like an assertion requiring no proof. Here something can begin. Her skin was stone before stone learned how to fracture. Her flesh was earth before earth learned how to hold footprints. Her breath was the faintest motions, vibrations, without names that millions of years later humans would call wind seasons, the turning rhythm of life. Gaia did not hurry. She did not need to be seen. She did not need to be remembered. Within her lived the patience of things that no time will eventually have to pass through them. Yet even a singular presence, no matter how vast, no matter how stable, carries a sensation humans would later learn to name: emptiness, not loneliness. Loneliness requires an other. Gaia's emptiness was that of the only thing in existence without symmetry, without response, without any reference to confirm that she existed at all. And from that emptiness, not ambition, not hunger for dominion, but a deeply primitive need arose, the need for an opposite. Gaia brought forth the sky. Uranus was not shaped, not lifted, not summoned. He rose, a vast cold dome, distant, glittering with points of light, not yet named, stretching above Gaia like a cloak of silence. For the first time, space learned to hold distance. For the first time, there was above and below. Gaia below, Uranus above. Between them, a space held long enough for the world to breathe. They did not love one another, not in any way humans would later understand. They coordinated. Earth held, sky covered, a simple structure, yet sufficient for the first life to emerge. And within that structure, something new appeared, unnamed at first, yet destined to shape all that followed: power. Because once there is above and below, questions arise about support dependence and what happens if one side disappears. Gaia began to bear children, not in pain, but with the steady rhythm of a body doing what it was made to do. From her, the 12 Titans emerged. They were not kings, not yet gods of worship. They were living principles. Each carried a raw function of existence, the tireless flow of water light, that required no explanation memory, that does not forget law before language, the endurance of stone, and the ambition of things that wish to move beyond their assigned place. They stood like undecorated pillars, holding the world upright in its first moment. But Gaia did not stop with what could be easily accepted. From deeper layers within herself, where order had not yet reached, where form did not need to be beautiful, she bore other children. The Cyclopes single-eyed not from lack, but from focus. They did not look around. They looked through, into the core of matter itself. And deeper still, the Hecatoncheiries, 100-handed, 50-headed forms that even future language would hesitate to describe. They were not born to be beautiful, not born to be loved. They were born because the world needed force before form, the ability to hold, and break before balance. When Uranus looked upon them, the sky recoiled for the first time, not in disgust but in fear. A sharp, cold fear running across the vault of heaven. Uranus understood what Gaia had always known. Once life is created, it no longer fully belongs to its creator, and fear, when not faced, seeks expression through command. Uranus pressed down upon Gaia, not in love, but in control. He forced the children he could not understand back into their mother, not symbolically, not metaphorically, but physically, stone upon stone, silence upon silence. Gaia, mother of the world, became the first prison. Within her arms, struck rock eyes opened in darkness. Soundless screams ran through the body of a planet. Earth cracked. Mountains twisted. Forests nodded in pain without name. Gaia did not cry out, because the world then had no language for its own suffering. But something new was born. Not a god, not a monster. The first anger of existence. An anger not rushed, not explosive. It lay there heavy as stone, slow as time before motion. And that anger would not sleep forever. It would learn how to wait. After sky and earth found one another, the world did not immediately become stable. That union did not bring peace. It brought something larger, deeper, and far more subtle, the problem of how to exist without collapsing under one's own weight. For once, space had an above and a below. Once time had begun to have a before and an after, every movement now needed to be held within a certain range. Without restraint, the very life that had just begun would tear itself apart before it could learn how to continue. And so the 12 Titans appeared. They did not emerge as individuals stepping out of darkness. They were not born to be named, nor to be worshipped. They arrived as principles placed into the world, foundational forces required to keep reality from slipping away from itself. They did not carry form meant to be seen, but function meant to be felt in the same way humans would later feel wind without ever seeing its shape, or feel gravity without ever seeing the hand that pulls them downward. Some Titans held the flow in motion, not by pushing it forward, but by preventing stagnation. For water, when denied movement, does not become a peaceful lake. It becomes a swamp of decay, where time no longer advances, but circles endlessly within its own stench. That flow was not only water, it was everything that tends to move blood in the first living bodies, thought in minds not yet fully formed, and the quiet changes the world requires in order not to die from standing still. Some Titans held light not to banish darkness, but to ensure that light would not become the exclusive property of day. For if day were allowed to stretch endlessly, night would be crushed, and in a world without night, without rest, without cover, life would burn itself out by the very force that once sustained it. Light needed limits, just as darkness needed permission to exist. And that Titan stood between the two, not favoring either side, only ensuring that the alternation itself was never broken. Some Titans held memory, a function far heavier than humans later imagined. Memory was not merely something to recall, it was a defense against total erasure. If everything passed without leaving a trace, existence would become meaningless even to itself. The Titan of memory did not preserve every detail. They preserved the structure of inscription itself, so that an action could leave a consequence, so that a choice could be connected to an outcome, and so that time would not dissolve into a series of unrelated moments. Some Titans held law before law required language. Not law as right or wrong, but law as limit, the law of what may pass and what must stop, of what may coexist and what must not, if the world is to continue. This Titan did not judge, did not punish, but stood as an invisible boundary, forcing every force that touched it to adjust itself or tear the shared structure apart. Some Titans held endurance, a quality rarely celebrated yet. Without it, everything would collapse at the first strain. Endurance was not explosive strength. It was the ability to stand longer than anger, to survive repetition, to exist through cycles without requiring glory. Stone stands because of this Titan. Mountains do not dissolve because of this Titan. And later, human societies would unknowingly relearn this lesson even after forgetting the name of the one who first held it in place. Some Titans held ambition, a dangerous but necessary function. For if the world did not desire to move forward, did not long to exceed its present state, it would grow complacent and halt too soon, becoming a structure perfect in form, but dead in essence. Ambition, when held within bounds, is an engine. When unheld, it is catastrophe. This Titan did not encourage ambition. They contained it, preventing it from becoming a bottomless hunger that devours all else. The remaining Titans held forces humans would later name, in many ways, the order of celestial bodies, the rhythm of seasons, the transmission of sound, the stability of form, and the endurance of matter under sustained pressure. No Titan was omnipotent. No Titan was unnecessary. They existed as a system of mutual support, each holding one portion, and it was precisely this fragmentation that prevented power from concentrating at a single point. And then deeper still, within layers of stone, the sky itself could not reach, something else began to form. Not as principle, but as raw force. Gaia first gave birth to the Cyclops. They were not born to maintain balance, nor to operate any cycle. They were born because the world had begun to require the creation of things that had never existed before. And creation demands a kind of focus no distributed principle can provide. Each Cyclops had a single eye, not from lack, but because all their attention converged on one point. They did not look around. They did not hesitate. They looked directly at the thing being formed and did not look away until it existed. Where they stood, stone learned how to soften. Metal learned how to remember shape. Fire ceased to merely consume and began to forge. The Cyclopes spoke little because they did not need language. Their speech was the rhythm of the hammer and the steady breath of an action, repeated until it was right. For the first time, the world gained the ability to be remade. But Gaia did not stop there. Deeper still, where force had accumulated so long it could no longer be distinguished from essence itself, she gave birth to the Hecatoncheires. 100 hands, 50 heads, not an exaggeration of imagination, but the expression of a very real necessity. The world needed force. before it needed form the ability to lift, and to shatter before it needed balance. The Hecatoncheires were not created to refine, but to move what could not be moved, to lift masses that even the Titans could only stand before. They did not stand still. They did not fit the mold. And precisely because of this, they could not be placed into the existing order without causing that order to tremble. When Uranus looked down upon these children, the sky recoiled for the first time, not in disgust, not in hatred, but because of fear, but because of a feeling entirely new, entirely cold, running across the vault of the sky, like a thin fracture, the fear of being replaced. Uranus understood, not through reasoning, but through instinct, that once life has been brought into being, it no longer belongs entirely to the one who created it. The Titans could hold, the Cyclopes could create, and the Hecatoncheires could tilt the entire structure itself. That fear did not seek release through dialogue. It sought release through control. And from that moment on, order began to carry within it a latent violence, even though not a single blow had yet been struck. The sky did not deliberate. Uranus did not sit back to weigh possibilities, did not search for explanations, did not attempt to understand what was changing beneath him. For absolute power, when confronted with what it cannot control, does not turn toward understanding. It turns toward reflex. And that reflex is always simpler than any argument remove the source of instability. Uranus pressed downward, not like a father seeking to protect, not like a god attempting to repair, but like the sky increasing its own weight, crushing whatever made it feel no longer absolutely secure in its position. The Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires were not named. They were not judged. No accusations were spoken. They were simply pushed away from the surface of the world, away from where light could still reach away from the space that the existing order allowed to exist. Not because they had done anything wrong, but because their very capacity alone was already a threat. Uranus did not hate them. He did not need to hate them. Fear was enough, and that fear found its outlet through force. The sky pressed upon Gaia more heavily than before. No longer the everyday contact between above and below, but a prolonged crushing act, a weight that bore down not only on land and body, but on the world's very capacity to open itself. Those children who exceeded the framework were forced back into their mother's depths, not as symbol, not as metaphor, but as extended physical action, stone upon stone, layer upon layer, until no direction of escape remained. Arms that once could lift mountains were pressed into darkness without orientation. Eyes that once looked directly into creation were opened in spaces never meant to contain life. The reverberations of force were driven back into Gaia's own body, spreading slowly like echoes through a prison without doors. And thus Gaia became the first prison, not because she chose to, not because she wished it, but because the foundation of the world, when given nowhere to retreat, has only one way left to continue existing to endure. That pain did not erupt. It did not scream. It did not tear the surface open. It grew thick, heavy, and spread very slowly through layers of stone, through veins of earth, through subtle movements that millions of years later, humans would name in fragments. Earthquakes, volcanoes, the fractures of history. The world at that time had no language to name its own pain, so it accumulated. Gaia did not cry out, not because she did not suffer, but because at that moment, pain had not yet been recognized as something that deserved to be heard. She carried the weight not as a sacrifice meant to be remembered, but as a foundation with no option other than to continue bearing load, even as it was being crushed. And within that prolonged endurance, something new began to form. Not immediately, not clearly, but irreversibly. Not a god, not a monster, but the first anger of existence itself, an anger that did not rush, did not explode, did not seek to shatter everything at once. It lay there, heavy, like unquarried stone, slow like time not yet measured, patient like earth, that knows every power, sooner or later, must place its full weight upon it. That anger learned how to wait. For Gaia understood what Uranus did not. Not every order collapses with a scream, and not every tyranny ends in direct collision. Meanwhile, on the surface of the world, the Titans continued to function. They did not argue over roles. None of them claimed to be the center, for at that time there was still no center. The world still operated like a stretched ring, each Titan a pulling force, and it was precisely the even tension that kept everything from falling back into chaos. But that ring was no longer pure. It now carried the memory that a force could be pressed down, could be removed if it became too different, and from that point a very small seed began to appear. For when principles take form, they begin to recognize one another. And when principles recognize one another, they begin to compare. Not through words, but through a dim sensation, who is bearing more, who stands closer to the foundation, who if removed would cause the world to tilt first. These questions were not spoken, but they existed. And wherever there is a question of position, power is learning how to take shape. The Titans did not yet conflict, but the world for the first time contained enough elements for conflict to become possible. And that possibility, like everything else in the universe, did not need to be forced. It only needed time to move from an unspoken thought into something unavoidable. Uranus looked down upon the Titans and did not feel threatened. He saw order, he saw operation, and he believed that everything still lay beneath his sky. Gaia felt differently. She did not see the Titans as tools, but as signs that the world had grown complex enough to require keepers. And once keepers are needed, absolute power has begun to lose its necessity. The Titans did not rule, they operated. They did not demand obedience, nor did they require remembrance. But precisely because of this, they became difficult to control. For an order based on function is more durable than an order based on command. And Uranus, though he was the sky, still sensed a subtle shift, difficult to name, like standing on ground, that does not collapse, but is no longer entirely silent. The world still stood firm, but it stood in a new way, no longer only above and below, but a network of tensions balanced by forces that never met at a single point. And within that balance, a seed began to form. Not rebellion, not yet conflict, but the possibility that order could be reorganized. Gaia did not push that possibility forward. She simply allowed it to exist. For she understood what the sky had not yet learned: not all change comes from collision, and not all collapse requires a roar. Some shifts begin so slowly that no one names them as shifts until it is too late to return. And among the 12 Titans, one listened to that slowness more clearly than the others. Not because he was stronger, but because he was less bound. He did not hold light, he did not hold law, he did not hold memory. Cronus stood at the intersection of functions, where what was held began to touch what was held by others, creating friction. He had not acted. He had not conceived rebellion, but he had learned the first lesson of history. These comparisons did not take the shape of debate nor of clear ambition. They existed as a minute deviation in perception, like a force that senses it must strain slightly more to compensate for another, or a principle that realizes if it were removed, the world would not collapse immediately, but would begin to lean in a direction no one could fully control. No Titan spoke of this, for to speak is to acknowledge, and acknowledgement is the first step toward demand. They continued to function as before, kept their rhythms, stood in positions formed since the beginning. But within that stability, awareness of their own necessity emerged not as pride, but as a quiet question. If I were no longer here, what would change? And with that question, another more dangerous one was born, silent, deeper. who decides that the world did not yet have a center of power, but it now possessed the conditions for one to appear. For when forces begin to recognize that they are not entirely equivalent, that some points in the structure bear more pressure than others, balance ceases to be merely a state and becomes a problem that must be managed. And wherever something must be managed, there will be one who wishes to manage it. Gaia sensed this change not through thought, but through the deep feeling of the foundation itself. She saw no titan rise up, saw no order crack. Yet she felt something new. The world was no longer merely being held, it was beginning to be evaluated. Principles no longer existed only within their isolated functions. They began to reflect upon one another like pillars in a structure that for the first time realized some carry more weight than others. Uranus did not sense this immediately. The sky was accustomed to height to distance, to the feeling that everything below still depended upon it. And precisely because of that, he failed to see that necessity was shifting, not disappearing, but dispersing. Absolute power was not being challenged, but it was becoming less relevant to the way the world now held itself together. The Titans still did not conflict, but the silence between them was no longer pure silence. It began to carry the weight of things not yet spoken. The world at this moment was like a surface of still water. No ripples visible, yet beneath it, currents already crossed, not strong enough to form a vortex, but enough to shift anything placed upon it without immediate notice. There was no war, no betrayal, but there was accumulation, and that accumulation did not require violence to become dangerous. It only required time, for time was no longer a vague possibility. It had learned how to remain. It began to count even without numbers. It began to remember even without memory. And in its patient slowness, time did what it has always done best. It turned possibility into inevitability. The Titans did not yet know they were stepping into history. They still believed they were merely holding the world together. But the world had changed the nature of its question. It no longer asked how to exist. It began to ask who would decide how that existence would be shaped. And when a world asks that question even without sickles, without curses, without blood, the First Order has already begun to approach its limit. Gaia's anger did not rush toward action, because that anger was not born to liberate in an instant, but to endure long enough for endurance itself to become a pressure that could no longer be ignored. She still held the sky on her back, as she had always held it, still allowed Uranus to spread his cold vault across the body of the Earth, like a habit embedded deep inside the order of things, and still gave birth in the old rhythm, neither hurried nor delayed, so that everything on the outside would look as though nothing had changed. But in the depths, where even silence had weight, where compression was no longer simply pain, but a slow language of force, Gaia began to do what she had never done before she chose. That choice did not arrive as a bright, unmistakable moment. It carried no sign by which it could be recognized, and it was not marked by any ritual. It happened the way Earth chooses, where it will crack, or the way water chooses the path of least resistance as it seeps through stone. Among the Titans who had been born as principles wearing form, there was one who did not stand out through strength, was not remembered for creation, and did not occupy the stations of law or memory. Cronus held no clear function, and precisely for that reason, he was not forced to remain still. He observed not with a sharp gaze, but with the patience of a force accustomed to waiting until things revealed their own weakness. Cronus did not believe the current order was eternal, not because he was rebelling, but because he had seen too many things remain upright only by habit. He did not stand near the sky to hunger for power, nor did he cling deep into the earth to seek safety. He stayed in between where forces crossed, where equilibrium was thinnest, and that position made him the one who could tilt the entire structure with a single act if that act was placed at the right time. Gaia did not call Cronus with words because words at that time were still too crude to carry intention. She called him through a faint resonance in the ground, through subtle tremors traveling across layers of rock, through moments when what seemed stable suddenly became fragile in a way no one could explain. Cronus heard not because he understood more clearly than the others, but because he was used to listening to things that had not yet become sound. When he came, Gaia did not rise, did not rage, did not weep. She opened, from her own body, from the layers of stone that had carried the sky's weight for too long. Gaia drew forth an object that was not a weapon in the familiar sense, and yet not merely a tool. The sickle was not bright, not adorned, bearing no emblem and no oath. It curved the way a moon without a name curves sharp, the way an intention that has waited long enough no longer trembles. Gaia did not tell Cronus what he must do. She only placed the sickle into his hand and let its weight speak the rest. Cronus understood at once, and that understanding separated him from the other Titans. For what was about to happen was not a rebellion, not revenge, and not correction in any moral sense. It was transfer the moment when an order could no longer bear itself, and another order had to appear, even though no one yet knew what it would become. Night did not come with thunder. There were no omens, no trembling of the stars, no voice echoing through space. There was only Uranus stretching himself down upon Gaia, as he always did, believing his power had been locked in place by fear and habit. Cronus waited. He did not rush forward, did not shout, did not hesitate. He waited for the moment when the sky was most confident and the world most quiet, because that is always when a structure is most vulnerable. When the sickle swung, it did not cut by force, but by irreversibility. The sound was not a scream, but the sound of a system being separated for the first time in the history of existence. The sky bled, not like a creature, but like an order losing its anchor point. Blood fell into the sea, into the earth, into spaces that had not yet been named, and from that new forms began to take shape forms that no one in that moment could fully understand. Uranus withdrew, not collapsing, not dying, but losing the right to touch. He pulled himself up higher, becoming sky as permanent distance, and in that withdrawal, he left behind a curse not meant to threaten, but to remind the one who overthrows will also be overthrown. Cronus remained. He did not tremble. He did not celebrate. He held the sickle and felt for the first time the cost of changing an order, because from that moment onward, he was no longer the one in between. He was the new center, and a center sooner or later learned something very old. Power is not born from victory, but from the fear of losing what has been seized. Cronus took the throne not through coronation, not through praise, but through the heavy silence of forces rearranging themselves around him. Gaia was silent, not because she was satisfied, and not because she was glad. She knew an order had fallen, but the new order did not yet know what it would become. In deeper layers of the earth, arms held in compression trembled faintly, eyes that could not close flickered. History had taken a step, and from here on, every next step would no longer be as light as this one. Cronus began to rule not through immediate violence, but through obsession. Uranus's curse did not leave him. It did not ring in him as a voice. It lay inside him like a cold stone, making every decision carry a shadow that could not be brushed away. Cronus looked at the world through the lens of defense. He kept the Titans in their positions, not to maintain balance, but to control. He looked down into the depths where the Hecatonchires and the Cyclopes lay buried, and he did not see beings who needed release. He saw possibilities that could tilt his order. Fear did not weaken him, it hardened him. And that hardness began to spread through the entire structure of the world. Gaia watched and did not intervene. She had done what a foundation can do. She had created the possibility of change. The rest no longer belonged to her. In the prolonged silence, the new order began to take clearer shape, not through prosperity or peace, but through tension held tight. The world still stood, but it stood like something compressed for too long, where every movement had to ask permission, and every birth carried risk. Somewhere deep in the earth, between arms pressed tight and eyes that could not close, a very slow possibility continued to form. Not yet a plan, not yet resistance, but a simple and dangerous thought: the current order is not the only order that can exist. And when the world was able to think that history had begun, though no one was close enough or safe enough to name it. Cronus took the throne without needing a rite. There was no chosen day, no stone dais raised, no oath read aloud between sky and earth. His reign began in the moment the sky retreated, and silence stayed when the high vault no longer pressed down upon the foundation as it had before, and that new emptiness forced the world to reorganize the weight of its own existence. Cronus stood at the intersection, where forces were rearranging themselves not as a victor, but as the only one whose hand did not tremble when he had to hold what had just been severed from its old habit. He did not praise what he had done, nor did he deny it. The sickle was laid down, not hung high as a symbol, not hidden away like guilt. It remained there as an object that had finished its first task and was ready for the next if the world ever had to call its name again. Cronus understood what very few rulers understand. At the beginning, a new order does not need to be proven by strength. It needs to be maintained long enough with enough stability that everyone forgets other possibilities ever existed. And so he began by holding. The age of Cronus is not remembered through battles, nor carved into memory by monumental works. It moved forward in a different way, quietly, and sealed like a season that lasts so long, people forget other seasons ever existed. Under that reign, the world was not chaotic, not starving, not screaming for change. Everything ran smoothly to the point of near numbness, and it was that smoothness that made time begin to lose its edge. Trees grew in their proper season. Rivers did not flood their banks. Light and shadow alternated with the exactness of something measured in advance. There was no invention, because there was no need to invent. There was no rebellion, because there was no injustice clear enough to name. But there was also no forward movement. The first beings lived longer than necessary to understand that they were living in a world that expected nothing from them. They were born, they existed, and then they dissolved, leaving very little trace behind, because memory under Cronus was not encouraged to expand. Memory was kept just enough for order not to repeat its mistakes, but never enough to become longing, never enough to become the desire, to step beyond what was already familiar. The Titans still held their roles, but their holding gradually became repetition. It was no longer a deliberate act, but habit. And habit, when it lasts long enough, replaces meaning with convenience. The world did not hurt, but it also did not dream. It existed in a neutral state where every fluctuation was treated as a risk to be eliminated early. Cronus looked upon his reign with a muted satisfaction. He saw a world that no longer threatened the central position he was holding. He took silence as proof of success. But he did not recognize that prolonged silence is not always consent. Sometimes it is simply the sign that everything has stopped asking questions. Time beneath that rain moved in a circle, not in a line. There was no before and after in the sense of development, only repetition and maintenance. What had happened would happen again, with differences too small to be called new. And within that circle, Cronus felt safe, because there was no point that led into a future beyond his sight. Yet deeper, so deep that power could no longer reach it by command or by habit, compression began to generate heat. Not the heat of rage, but the heat of possibility held back too long. The world did not explode. It simply thickened. Layer upon layer of existence pressed together, waiting for the smallest gap through which to breathe. Cronus's reign, therefore, was not darkness, and it was not light. It was a prolonged twilight where the sun never fully set, yet never rose high. Where everything was held in the state of enough safety, enough stability, enough to make people forget that existence is not only to be held, but also to be allowed to become something else. And precisely within such an enough world, the greatest absence began to take shape, the absence of a future. Not a future destroyed, but a future never permitted to appear. The age of Cronus stood firm, but it stood like a perfectly still sheet of water, without ripples so deep no one could see the bottom, and so calm no one could hear the world's heartbeat slowing down. Cronus did not change the Titans immediately. He left them in their places, holding the principles they had held since the beginning, because a change too soon would reveal how fragile the new structure still was. He learned to rule through delay by letting the world believe that nothing had truly changed, while each anchor point was tightened a little more. Each acceptable range of movement narrowed a little further, but along with holding, Cronus began to observe. He observed the places where force accumulated, the places where rhythms fell out of phase, the places where if a principle withdrew, the world would not collapse at once, but it would begin to lean. And within those observations, Uranus's curse never left him. It did not speak in a voice, it did not become an image. It lay still inside awareness, like a weight that could not be set down. The one who topples will also be toppled. Cronus did not treat the curse as fate. He treated it as information. That information taught him the first lesson of power. The most dangerous thing is not the enemy outside, but the possibility of replacement from within. And then the children were born. They did not appear as an immediate threat. They cried, they grew, they carried within them fragments of the order Cronus had held, and precisely because of that, they unsettled him in a subtle, intricate way. Because every child that is born is a new starting point, and every starting point carries the possibility of veering away from the road already drawn. Cronus did not hate his children. He did not fear them in the ordinary sense. He feared time, because time, once it has learned to count, never stands on the side of the one sitting at the top. Time does what it has always done. It turns the center into the past. And Cronus, the one who had severed the sky in order to create a present, understood with perfect clarity the cost of becoming someone who was once necessary. And so he chose control in the most absolute form. Defensive power can imagine he prevented the future from appearing. That act did not happen in a frenzy. It was not driven by jealousy or hatred. It happened quietly, steadily, like a procedure. Each child was born, and each child disappeared into him, not as a burst of violence, but as a decision repeated until it became habit. The world did not scream. The Titans did not rise up. In Cronus's reign, the world learned something very dangerous. Safety can become a habit. And when safety becomes habit, people and even the earliest gods stop listening for the smallest signals of change. No one waited for a morning that would be different, because every morning was similar enough that hope was unnecessary, but comfortable enough that resistance felt pointless. Time under that rule was no longer an open current. It became an even rotation, a wheel in which each moment followed the last with near perfect similarity. What had once been seasons became a mold. What had once been life cycles became repetition. Birth was no longer a beginning. It became only continuation of forms already accepted in advance. Cronus believed this was his achievement. A world that did not need fixing. A world that did not demand its ruler change. But he did not recognize that the absence of demand does not mean agreement. There are kinds of dissatisfaction that cannot be spoken aloud because there has never been language to describe what has never been allowed to exist. Beneath that surface calm, the questions did not vanish. They simply were not asked. The other Titans sensed it in different ways. Some began to feel their roles growing lighter, as if the forces they held had become redundant. Some felt they were guarding something that no longer moved. Some realized that order, when it lasts too long, will eventually stop needing its guardians. And then there were very small moments, almost impossible to notice, when the world did not do exactly what it had always done. A river slowed by a single beat. A season extended beyond expectation. A creature lived longer than necessary, not because it was immortal, but because there was no clear reason to end. Those deviations were not large enough to terrify anyone, but they were enough to plant within the foundation of the order a strange sensation the world could operate differently. And when that sensation appears, even as a passing thought power begins to worry, Cronus began to look at everything with the gaze of one who has heard a prophecy. He no longer saw the world. He saw the possibility of replacement. He no longer listened to silence. He heard the footsteps of something that had not yet happened. And within that worry, his reign shifted from maintenance to control, not through violence, but through prevention. Cronus did not forbid dreams, because no one yet knew how to dream. But he tightened everything that could lead to dreaming, long memory, different stories, small variations of existence. Everything was held in the state of enough. Enough not to collapse. Enough not to produce new questions. Enough for time to keep turning without needing to advance. And precisely in a world where everything is enough, the greatest shortage begins to accumulate. Not a shortage of food, not a shortage of light, but a shortage of the ability to become something other than itself. Cronus's age, therefore, was not a dark age. It was an age held back, a world preserved perfectly, like a moment frozen before it could turn into memory. And within that freezing time, though restrained, kept learning something no god can prevent. Everything that exists long enough will change, even if it is forbidden. At the deepest point of that stability, where Cronus neither looked down nor wanted to look, a paradox began to grow. Only what is swallowed can pass through being swallowed. And Cronus's reign, while trying to keep the world still, had unwittingly created the perfect conditions for a movement nothing could hold back any longer, because on the surface, order still stood. Seasons still turned. Light still returned after night. Flow still continued. But somewhere very deep within the structure of existence, something was caught. The future no longer moved forward. It was trapped inside the loop of defense, where every new possibility was treated as a risk to be eliminated. Rhea saw it earlier than the others. She did not resist immediately. She did not name cruelty. She sensed it through an instinct, older than law and ambition, An order that eats itself in order to survive cannot last forever. Each time Cronus held a child back, the world did not fall, but it contracted. And that contraction, no matter how small, accumulated the way stone cracks, not from a single blow, but from pressure that lasts too long with no exit. Cronus believed he was keeping the world safe. Rhea knew he was freezing it. Between those two understandings, there was no argument. Only the long silence of a reign confident it had solved history's problem by removing the variable. But history is not a problem that accepts a closed solution. It is patient, and it waits. In Gaia's belly, where compressed forces had never forgotten, the ancient anger did not vanish. It settled, thickened, and learned to go around. Not by confrontation, but by birth. Not by breaking, but by slipping through the smallest fissures in control. Cronus did not see it. Not because he was blind, but because he had stared too long into his own fear. And when power can only see what it fears, it will miss what is growing right beneath its feet. Cronus's reign stood firm, but it stood like a door being held shut with all available strength, not to protect a safe space within, but to prevent the new from stepping in. And in a place very hidden, very small, very quiet, where a child was concealed not as rebellion, but as the Foundation's wise delay time, prepared for the moment. It always prepares for the moment when a defensive order realizes it cannot swallow the future forever. Zeus was not born at the moment the world realized it was changing. There was no thunder to announce him, no crack running across the sky, no clean interruption in the smooth, well-oiled order of Cronus's reign. If someone had stood far enough away and indifferent enough to watch, they might have said that nothing happened at all. Because in that era, the world had grown accustomed to noticing only what was large, what repeated what was allowed to exist long enough to become habit. A child was born in silence, carrying no symbol, carrying no prophecy read aloud, placed at the center of no ritual. And precisely because it was so small, so hidden, so easy to overlook, this event did not shake an order that had already learned how to ignore possibilities before they had time to grow. Cronus did not fear the cry of a newborn. He feared what came after that cry. He had learned through his own history that power is rarely defeated by direct shouting, but is more often worn down by things that are very small, very patient, very quiet, things that consent to remain outside the field of vision long enough that once they are finally noticed, there is no way back. And so Cronus did not argue with fate, did not challenge prophecy, did not try to understand it. He swallowed, not as an act of savage rage, but as an act of management. Each child that was born was not destroyed, but retained inside him, where there was no time to grow, no space to become something else, no future in which to develop into a threat. Cronus believed this was wisdom to keep the future in his own belly, so it could never arrive in time. But Zeus did not follow that path, not because he was stronger, but because he was not present to be seen. Rhea understood this not through reason, but through an older kind of knowledge accumulated through losses that did not need to be named. The instinct of a mother who had watched too many children vanish taught her that confronting a frightened power head-on only makes it tighten its grip, swallow deeper, and barricade itself more carefully. And so she did not resist. She distracted. A child made of stone, wrapped in cloth, handed over with the proper gestures. This was not rebellion, but a slight deviation inside a familiar sequence. Cronus swallowed that shape, as he had swallowed everything before it, and in that moment he believed the order still stood. But order does not collapse in the instant Cronus swallows the wrong stone. Order begins to crack somewhere else, farther away, deeper down, and much more slowly. In a cave whose name appears on no map, in a space where light only visits enough not to disappear completely, yet never stays long enough to dominate, Zeus grew up outside the order. Not outside the world, but outside the control of power. There no clear boundary existed between inside and outside, between shelter and exposure. The cave did not close like a prison, nor open like a public square. It existed in an in-between state where everything was permitted to stay still, long enough not to be forced into becoming something. The cave did not teach him how to rule. It taught him how to remain without dissolving. Their time was not measured by seasons or divided by dynasties. It dripped little by little, the way water finds its way through stone, without asking permission, without hurry, without needing recognition. Each passing moment did not carry the reminder that it must lead to another. There was no goal, no ending set in advance, only the slow continuation of existence, where simply continuing to breathe was enough to justify itself. Zeus learned how to exist before he learned how to act. He learned to listen to very small movements, the sound of stone expanding in the cold, the sound of water falling without leaving a trace, the shift of air when light arrived and then departed. No one told him these things mattered, but precisely because no one guided him, he learned not to overlook them. In the cave, nothing was so large it eclipsed everything else, and so every detail had the chance to be felt. No symbols of power surrounded him. No throne to teach him how to sit. No story of bloodline repeated each day to remind him where he belonged. Names were not spoken often, and so they did not become chains. Zeus did not grow up believing he was destined to rule. He grew up with the sense that the world owed him nothing, and did not demand that he prove his worth by claiming the center. Within the absence of demand, Zeus learned a rare kind of freedom, the freedom not to hurry, not to grow too fast, not to perform, not to make himself frightening in order to be respected. The cave gave him what every regime of power tries to destroy at the beginning time, to form without being watched. There, Zeus was not pressured into becoming the answer to someone else's fear. He was not the solution to a prophecy, not the object of expectation. He was only a being growing up in a world indifferent enough not to intervene, and patient enough not to decide too soon. And in that state, layers of thought formed in him not along a straight line, but in wide arcs where everything could return later, carrying a different meaning. The cave also taught Zeus another lesson. Even without words, every real strength needs a darkness in which to mature. Light that is too strong reveals shape too early. Constant attention distorts intention. Only in a darkness that is just enough, neither devouring nor exposing, can a new possibility grow without being forced to define itself before it is ready. And so when Zeus sat in the cave, it was not to escape the world, but to give the world time to forget he existed. Nothing is more dangerous to power than a new capacity allowed to grow without surveillance. Nothing makes an order more uneasy than something that has matured in silence, unaccustomed to being commanded, unafraid to wait. In that way, the cave was not only the place where Zeus was hidden, it was the place where time was returned to its proper rhythm. And within that slow rhythm, a very different kind of strength began to form, not loud, not ostentatious, but deep enough that when it emerged, it would not need to prove it had the right to exist. And precisely in being unfed by service, Zeus learned what Cronus never learned. Power does not come from keeping everything still, but from the ability to wait until movement becomes unavoidable. The cave did not give him answers. It gave him lag between desire and action, between fear and reflex, between the thought "I can" and the decision "not yet." This was the art of waiting, not waiting in helplessness, but waiting in observation. Zeus watched the light enter the cave each day at a slightly different angle. He watched how sound never echoed back the same way twice. He watched how the smallest creatures learned not to step on their own footprints, as if they understood that repetition is not always safety. From those tiny details, he understood that the world does not run on commands, but on relationships between forces. No strength exists alone. No power stands if it does not understand what it is resting upon. Cronus ruled by freezing. Zeus learned to rule by listening to the fatigue of order. One believed stability was achieved when every movement was held in place, when every new possibility was controlled from its first breath. The other learned from stone and water and darkness that no structure can endure forever if it is never allowed to change the rhythm of its own breathing. But Zeus did not arrive at that understanding through theory. It seeped into him slowly, through watching, through waiting, through letting everything reveal its own exhaustion without being forced to confess it. As Zeus grew, he did not hurry to leave the cave, not because he was afraid, but because there was no need. In the cave, he felt with clarity that timing is not something you can force into existence by will. Timing appears only when what is necessary has arranged itself. And outside, the reign of Cronus continued running with a suspicious smoothness. Everything still felt enough safety, that no one felt the need to defend enough stability, that no one thought to question enough silence, that every unease dissolved into habit. Zeus did not mistake that silence for peace. He heard something else in it, the way someone who has lived long in a cave can hear stone shifting slightly before a crack forms. Cronus's order did not complain. It did not resist. It only required more and more energy to keep its shape unchanged. The harder it tried to freeze, the more tightly it had to squeeze. The more tightly it squeezed, the more vigilant it had to become toward every seed of difference, no matter how small. And it was precisely that constant vigilance that created fatigue. Not the fatigue of the oppressed, but the fatigue of the one who must control everything in order to exist. An order that must keep watch over itself never truly rests. It is not allowed to relax, not allowed to slow, not allowed to permit. And Zeus understood that this kind of fatigue does not show itself as sudden collapse, but as hairline tensions, decisions that grow heavier, reflexes that grow more rigid, fears that must be buried deeper and deeper. Zeus did not break that order at once, because breaking an order that still trusts itself only makes it contract and harden. He had learned from the body of the earth itself that force applied too early only makes stone denser. If you want stone to open, you let pressure accumulate until it can no longer bear its current shape. Zeus did not try to create that pressure. He simply did not release it. He let Cronus's order continue to run by its own logic, so that every freezing decision today became the burden of tomorrow. He waited for that order to grow tired of holding the same shape too long, tired of controlling every new possibility from the moment it appeared. tired of never being allowed to breathe in a different way. Tired of believing that if it loosened its grip by even a fraction, the entire world would fall back into chaos. Tired of no longer trusting the flexibility of the very foundation on which it stood. And while the order outside grew weary, Zeus did not grow by accumulating power, but by accumulating listening. He listened not with ears, but with patience. He let what was overworking itself reveal its limits. He understood that the moment of change does not arrive when someone strong enough rises, but when the old order is no longer strong enough to keep standing. That is why when Zeus finally stepped out of the cave, it did not happen like an uprising. It happened like a response. Zeus did not summon the new age. The world in its quiet fatigue had become ready to hear a different rhythm. And Zeus, the one who had learned to wait, the one who had learned not to impose in haste, was the only one still lucid enough to recognize that moment when it arrived. Meanwhile, Zeus did not hold on to anything at all. He let everything pass through him. Memory, sound, uncertainty, questions without answers. And precisely because he did not hold, he had room to receive. The cave gradually ceased to be merely a hiding place. It became a school of time. Zeus understood that not every overthrow needs strength. Some orders fall when the thing they are pressing upon stops consenting to hold them up. He did not focus on defeating Cronus. He focused on understanding the world Cronus was trying to hold, where it tightened, where it grew tired, where it began to crack, though no one wanted to look. And when Zeus stepped out, it was not a moment of light confronting darkness, but a moment of time meeting itself again after a long compression. Zeus carried no promises and no fury. He carried the ability to remain still longer than fear, and that is something no tyranny knows how to fight. Cronus did not sense danger. What he sensed, if it could even be called sensing, was familiarity. Zeus did not disturb the air. He did not alter the temperature of the hall. He did not bend the light or cast a new shadow. His presence did not announce itself as a rival, but as something that had always belonged there and had simply not been noticed for a long time. Power, after all, does not remain alert forever. It grows selective. It watches for what has hurt it before. It remembers large threats, loud disruptions, sudden ruptures. But it forgets to look for what has learned how to exist without asking permission. Zeus stood where servants had stood, where messengers had passed through, where countless minor presences had moved without ever registering as events. He occupied no symbolic position. He claimed no axis. He did not challenge the geometry of the hall. And because of that, the geometry did not react to him. Cronus looked upon Zeus the way a system looks upon a detail it has already categorized as harmless. Younger, smaller, contained, not carrying the weight of disruption, not radiating urgency, not demanding response. In a reign built on the management of extremes, moderation passed unnoticed. The hall itself had learned this lesson well. It had been trained to recognize only certain kinds of movement as meaningful. Only those that accelerated too fast. Only those that pressed upward. Only those that sought the center too openly. Everything else, the slow, the lateral, the patient, was absorbed into background. And so Zeus remained background. Not because he hid, but because the rain had trained itself to stop looking there. Cronus's rule had endured precisely because it had narrowed its field of attention. Stability had taught it efficiency. Efficiency had taught it blindness. The longer nothing broke, the more certain Cronus became that nothing could break, at least not in any way worth preparing for. The center of the hall felt secure. The silence felt earned. The weight of the world sat comfortably on a structure that had not shifted in a very long time. And Zeus, standing within that silence, did not rush to interrupt it. He waited, not for permission, not for an opening, but for the moment when the stillness itself would reveal what it had been holding back all along. Because the most decisive changes do not begin when a system feels threatened. They begin when a system feels certain it no longer needs to be. Zeus stopped at a distance that was just enough, not so close, that it could be read as intrusion, not so far that it would feel foreign. That distance was not measured in footsteps, but in the sense of safety that power requires. Cronus looked at him not with suspicion, only with recognition. A younger being, a movement that did not disrupt, not a threat, not something that needed to be eliminated at once. The cup rested in Zeus's hand with a steadiness that did not ask to be noticed. It was not presented forward, not raised, not framed as an act. It existed in the space between bodies, where maintenance happens, where things are passed, not to change the world, but to keep it from collapsing under its own weight. This was the language Cronus understood best. Not command, not challenge, but upkeep. The medicine carried no signal of intent. It was not rare, not sacred, not dangerous in any obvious way. Its very ordinariness made it invisible. In a reign built on preventing catastrophe, catastrophe was the only thing worth watching for. Zeus's voice when he spoke did not push against the air. It settled into it. He spoke of what the body needed, of strain, of rest, of the heaviness that comes from holding everything still for too long. Nothing he said pointed forward. Nothing gestured toward consequence. His words did not open horizons. They closed gaps. They named familiar sensations without interpreting them the way one names pain without assigning it meaning. The effect was not persuasion, but reassurance. Cronus did not weigh the moment. He did not pause to assess. He did not feel the need to decide. His hand moved because it always had. This was the gesture of a system responding to itself, a maintenance loop completing its cycle. The cup passed from one hand to another, not as an exchange, but as continuation, as something already accounted for. Cronus had learned over ages that danger announced itself loudly, that threats arrived wrapped in ambition, in prophecy, in urgency. He had learned to harden himself against upheaval, against force, against the unmistakable shape of rebellion. What he had not learned was how to guard against familiarity. Zeus did not rush the moment. He did not watch the cup too closely. He did not lean in. He allowed the action to finish itself. And when Cronus drank, it was not with trust nor with suspicion, but with the deepest vulnerability of power habit. A habit so perfected that it no longer registered as choice. Inside Cronus nothing erupted, nothing resisted, nothing announced itself as wrong. What began instead was memory, not as images, not as pain, but as pressure returning to places that had been sealed too long. The kind of pressure that does not explode, but insists. The kind that does not accuse, but reminds. Zeus did not step back. He remained where he was, steady, unremarkable, as if nothing had occurred, because in the logic of the reign, nothing had. Yet somewhere beneath the structure that had been held immobile for so long, something shifted its weight, not enough to collapse, not enough to alarm, just enough to make standing still no longer effortless. And that was all Zeus needed. When Cronus drank, nothing happened at once. No sound, no shaking, no sudden pain to make him suspicious. only a very strange, very slow sensation, like a colossal slab of ice beginning to realize that the temperature around it has changed at some point. Not melting yet, only no longer certain that it will keep its old shape forever. Cronus set the cup down, an ordinary gesture, yet heavier than usual, though he himself did not yet know why. Zeus did not step back, nor did he step forward. He stood still the way stone stands in a cave, not waiting for an outcome, not demanding a response. He knew that what had just entered Cronus's body was not poison in any simple sense. It was an invitation to face. Inside Cronus, what had been swallowed did not scream. It did not thrash. It only remembered that it had once existed, and memory once awakened cannot be smothered by will alone. Cronus felt a pressure running against the direction of power, not from outside, but from the very foundation he had used to keep the world still. Zeus did not look at Cronus with the eyes of victory. He looked with the attention of someone who had waited a long time for this moment, not to witness collapse, but to make sure that a door, once opened, would not be slammed shut again by panic. The cup had completed its role from the instant it was swallowed, not because it was strong, but because it was offered at the right time to an order already so tired it no longer had the capacity to swallow anything more. And Zeus, who carried no weapon, left the great hall the same way he had entered quietly, leaving no obvious sign behind, yet leaving an irreversible movement inside a reign that had once believed it would last forever. When the medicine was taken, there was no violent convulsion, no immediate downfall, only a change that was slow and heavy, like stone beginning to remember what has been pressed into it for too long. Cronus felt a pressure moving the wrong way, not from the outside, but from within. What he had swallowed to preserve order beings held captive inside the body of power began to demand their place in the world again. The return did not happen like a chaotic birth. It came in waves, in layers, in burdensome breaths. The gods who had been swallowed not dead, but suspended from existence, returned not as avengers, but as principles forced into silence for too long now, permitted to speak again in their own voice. None of them emerged with a roar. They emerged with the thickened silence of things held back for too long. Hestia returned first not carrying explosive flame, but carrying the ability to keep warmth. She did not demand a throne. She did not ask for an apology. Her presence simply made empty places no longer so cold they had to curl inward. Demeter returned with a rhythm of growth that had been interrupted, carrying the memory of harvests held back of soil that had waited too long to breathe in its own tempo. Hera returned not with fury, but with a gaze that measured the gaze of one who has learned that order does not require strength alone, but a binding that cannot be forced. Poseidon returned with the sea in his chest, not loud, but deep, like undercurrents that have patiently waited for the day they find an exit again. And Hades, the last to step out, did not bring darkness as a curse. He brought the capacity to set boundaries, something Cronus had never truly understood. Hades did not come to seize power, but to take the portion of work no one else wished to take, to manage what is excluded from light and still must be counted. Cronus fell not because he was defeated in battle, but because the system he built could no longer contain the very things it had tried to hold. That collapse was not deafening. It was like a colossal door shut for too long, finally opening, not by a kick, but by removing the rusted bolt from the inside. Zeus did not stand atop rubble to announce triumph. He stood beside what had returned, listening to the natural chaos of a world learning how to breathe again after a long time holding its breath. He understood that liberation does not end at the moment a door is opened. Liberation truly begins only when what has been released learns how to exist without needing to be swallowed again. The gods, upon returning, did not instantly form a new order. There was no charter, no immediate division of power. Zeus did not rush to impose structure. He had learned that any order born too quickly carries the fear of having to preserve itself at all costs. Instead, he let the presence of each god find its place not by rank, but by what the world now rebuilding itself required. In that loose interval, something very different appeared consent that was not rooted in fear. None of them was forced to stay. None was threatened if they left. And therefore, their choice to remain carried a weight the old reign had never possessed. The new order was not built by erasing difference, but by allowing difference to exist together without being swallowed. Zeus did not proclaim himself king at once. He did not need a title in order to act. His power did not come from standing above, but from keeping the rhythm of speech, the rhythm of silence, the rhythm of intervention and withdrawal. He knew the world had just passed through too great a release to endure another mold pressed into it. And so he chose to wait once more, not to postpone, but to allow what had returned to recognize that it was permitted to exist without needing to prove itself immediately. Seen in hindsight, the cup was not only a tool for overthrowing Cronus. It was the symbol of a different kind of change, not through direct opposition of force, but by compelling the old order to face what it had tried to bury. Zeus did not defeat Cronus with superior might. He let Cronus taste the consequence of his own method of rule. And the return of the gods was not merely a family event set right. It was the moment the world realized that anything held too long will find a way to return. And when it returns, it carries the memory of having been excluded. If the new order is to endure, it must learn how to live with that memory. Not erase it, not swallow it, but let it become part of the foundation. When night fell after the day of release, the world was not brighter, and it was not darker. It was simply different. There were more empty spaces, more uneven breaths. But within that unevenness, a fragile and dangerous possibility began to form the possibility of an order that knows it can change without needing to collapse entirely. And Zeus, who had waited long enough in darkness, stood in the middle of that return, not as a savior, but as a keeper of rhythm. Someone who understood that the hardest work is not overthrowing a reign, but ensuring that what has just been freed does not become a new prison. War does not begin with a shout. It begins with a change in pressure. None of the Titans declared rebellion. There was no moment when Cronus stood and announced that order had been betrayed. Such words appear only in stories told later, when humans need a clear starting point to hold on to. In the reality of the gods, the Titanomachy emerged the way a continent begins to drift. No one sees it move, yet everything above it begins to crack. After the cup of medicine, the world did not collapse. It simply lost the ability to keep its old shape. Decisions that had once flowed smoothly began to feel heavier. Commands that had once been obeyed without question now lingered longer in the air before being carried out. The Titans did not immediately doubt Cronus. They doubted the endurance of the very roles they were holding. And wherever a role begins to weigh more than its meaning, war has already begun. The Titanomachy was not a confrontation between two sides facing each other on a field. It was a prolonged condition in which every force in the universe began pulling in a different direction not yet strong enough to tear apart completely. Mountains did not collapse, seas did not rise, the sky did not split, yet everything carried within it a new tension, like a drumhead stretched too long, trembling at the passing of a single breath. That tension did not manifest as noise. It appeared as a subtle slowing of what had once functioned effortlessly. Water still flowed, but seemed to hesitate longer at each bend. The land still stood firm, but the deeper layers no longer fully trusted the form above them. Light still spread, but no longer covered everything with the same certainty as before. Nothing was clearly wrong, and precisely because of that, everything began to be wrong in ways that were hard to name. The Titans felt it as a vague discomfort, like a body that has grown accustomed to one posture, suddenly realizing that standing upright has become difficult. No one spoke of it, no one named it. But every attempt to maintain the old order now required more force than before. Every command had to be repeated. Every role had to be defended. Order was no longer a natural flow. It had begun to require effort to exist. And when order requires effort, it begins to consume itself. Zeus sensed this tension not as a signal to act immediately, but as an indicator to continue waiting. He understood that when forces are not yet strong enough to separate, any crude intervention would only cause them to recoil more violently. In the cave, he had learned that there are phases in which the only necessary action is to add no new force to an already overloaded system. During that time, the Titanomachy existed as an invisible pressure. It seeped into sleep. It gave the Titans dreams without endings. It made the younger gods feel as though they were standing in a room where the air was growing denser, even though no one had closed the doors. There was no battlefield, yet the entire world had become a front line. Each direction in space began to carry a different possibility. One pulled toward preservation, another toward opening. Below held the memory of what had been buried. Above held the fear of losing position. And between these directions, existence was stretched like metal before it breaks, not yet broken, but no longer whole. The most dangerous thing in this phase was not violence, but prolonged delay. For pressure that is not released does not disappear. It accumulates. It concentrates at the weakest points. And those points are rarely where guards stand watch most carefully. They lie where things are assumed to be stable, familiar, and in no need of inspection. Cronus felt the Titanomachy as a vague insult, not because anyone challenged him directly, but because the world no longer responded immediately to his commands. He had to invoke his authority more often. He had to remind others of his role more frequently, and with each reminder, he inadvertently confirmed that his power was no longer self-evident. The universe in that period was like a living being, holding its breath too long, not out of fear, but because it did not yet know how to breathe to a different rhythm. Every structure was waiting not for orders, but for a change large enough to force a reconfiguration. The Titanomachy, therefore, was not a moment. It was a span of time during which the universe endured its own contradiction. And in that endurance, every particle of existence learned that maintaining the old shape was no longer the safest option. When war finally erupted, it was not a surprise. It was something that could no longer be postponed. The drumhead had been stretched to the point that if it were not struck, it would tear itself apart. And the universe, like any living system, chose controlled release over undefined collapse. The Titanomachy began that way not with blades, but with pressure great enough to force everything to admit that the current order was no longer wide enough to contain what the world had become. Cronus sensed this before anyone else, not because he was wiser, but because the entire old order rested upon his presence. When he grew weary, the world grew weary with him. When he had to remind himself that he was in control, power had already ceased to function naturally. He summoned the Titans not to declare war, but to reinforce. Yet every reinforcement carried a new anxiety, the fear that if it were not spoken aloud, order would slip away. And the very need to speak it exposed the first crack. Zeus appeared. He did not gather armies. He did not erect symbols. He did not draw borders. He existed at the edges of every major decision, like a low-pressure system that caused everything around it to shift. The newly freed gods did not gather around Zeus because of command, but because they could no longer bear the old gravity. Hestia stood still, but her fire no longer accepted being extinguished in service of a frozen order. Demeter felt the ground beneath her stop, responding in the old way. Poseidon heard the seas begin to whisper different rhythms. Hades, the quietest among them, understood clearly that when what has been buried too long begins to demand space, the world must either restructure or shatter. The Titanomachy was therefore not a choice, it was a consequence. When the first clashes occurred, they did not resemble battles. They were small conflicts over who was permitted to decide what, who set boundaries, who named the law, who had the right to declare a new possibility, a threat, or a sign of life. Each time a Titan tried to preserve an old role, a younger god felt forced back into darkness. Each time Zeus refused to intervene with brute force, Cronus felt his authority erode in ways he could not grasp. Eventually, the pressure crossed its threshold, not because anyone wanted war, but because the universe could no longer endure its internal contradiction. When forces pull too long in opposing directions, release becomes the only remaining way to keep the structure from disintegrating entirely. When the Titanomachy erupted, it did not occur in a single place. It unfolded across every layer of existence. Mountains were lifted not from rage, but because the foundations could no longer bear compressed force. Seas rose not from hatred, but because old boundaries no longer fit. The sky thundered not because Zeus sought display, but because space required a new way to distribute energy. Cronus fought not like a mad tyrant. He fought like an old order trying to prove it was still necessary. Every strike carried the history of ages of stability. Every command carried the fear that if he let go, no one would be able to hold the world together. He was not a simple despot. He was someone who had held the world still for so long that he believed stillness itself was moral. The Titanomachy did not begin as a battle, nor did it continue as a siege, for it had no walls to surround, no gates to break, no geometry simple enough to reduce war to a diagram. It began as a change in atmospheric pressure, like standing in a room before a storm, sensing the air thicken, tasting a metallic edge at the back of the throat, while doors and walls and roofs have not yet shaken, but already know they will. It was a war of forces. It did not arrive and leave as humans imagine, but existed as a sustained state. Mountains did not fall immediately, but were pressed. Rivers did not flood immediately, but were constricted. The chests of every living being suddenly had to work harder to breathe, as if breath itself had been conscripted without consent. There were days when combat looked like two storms colliding over a plain so vast that the horizon was only a thin cut of light. When they met, they did not win or lose, but canceled portions of each other's energy, creating strange lulls, moments when dust settled. Roars receded, and survivors looked at one another with a hollow sense, as if waking in the middle of a long dream without remembering which side they were on. There were nights when both sides heard wolves howling from distant mountains, watched the same moon cross the same stretch of sky, and understood that nature did not choose sides, but war forced everything to have one. Even rivers had to take sides, even wind, even stone. And when stone takes sides, you know this battle is no longer just about gods, but about the structure of the world itself. And in this prolongation, Zeus began to understand something Cronus never fully grasped, that victory lies not in the strongest blow, but in the ability of a living system to continue functioning under pressure near breaking. That war is ultimately a test of who can organize life longer under conditions that resist life. Zeus did not build war like a dynasty builds monuments. He built it like a breathing system. He placed Themis at the center of invisible connections, not a center of power, but of discipline. She guarded oaths like a market keeper guarding scales where every side tries to cheat. In war, an oath is not decorative morality. It is steel in the frame. Whoever breaks it does not merely betray a person, but cracks a beam that can collapse the entire camp. Thus, Themis imposed punishments that were quiet, but hard as stone liars were denied. Shared fire, denied shared meals, forced to repay debt through service, until their names learned again how to stand upright in collective memory. Mnemosyne walked each morning while frost still clung and guards had not yet warmed their hands. She spoke the names of the dead, not to dramatize loss, but to prevent it from slipping into meaninglessness. In long war, death easily becomes statistics. When death becomes statistics, lives are thrown like pebbles. Any victory then rots from within before it can be named. Demeter walked the freshly dug trenches like cuts across the earth's skin and taught soldiers something that sounded absurd in war: to plant crops on ramparts, to lay topsoil along trench edges and sow quick barley so that every fortification became not just a wall, but a field. In this unwarlike act, the spirits of those holding positions through many seasons were saved. They smelled soil-green growth, future bread, and remembered they were not only killing, but trying to keep something alive. Hestia kept the fire. Simple perhaps, but in rains that could extinguish, will itself, fire was power. She kept it for cooking, warming healing, reminding camps they had not become beasts, reminding them that home could exist even as a circle of light in the night. She handed a warm bowl to a timid soldier who, 3 days later, would stand firm and save 50 lives when others fled, because heroes are sometimes born not of prophecy, but of a meal given on time. Hades counted the dead, and this counting was not cold, but foundational justice. He saw the living as a ledger, sees names not to deny their humanity, but to ensure every debt was recorded, every sacrifice carried weight. He forged agreements on compensation rotation of guard fair pay discipline against killing prisoners, because he understood something deeply practical. A kingdom after war survives only if moral debt does not become political debt. Poseidon, meanwhile, was not always the sea. The war taught him that oceans also live in the chest. He struck the ground with his shaft, and earth opened like a wet wound. A trench filled within the hour, stopping the enemy's first wave, in stunned disbelief that what humans call terrain can be rewritten instantly when a god demands an answer. None of this brought immediate victory, but it created what Cronus slowly lost, without naming it the capacity to endure. On the Titan side, Cronus did not remain idle. But an old order under threat often responds with the tools it once used to freeze the world fear pride and the belief that a little more force will restore proper placement. Hyperion burned entire hillsides so dawn exposed Zeus's troops, blinding eyes aching bones because light too strong is a weapon. Coeus spread maps and angles calculations, placing enemies in the wrong rivers, wrong valleys, his logic terrifyingly precise, for intellect, severed from loyalty, becomes a cold scalpel. Crius twisted winds breaking formations, extinguishing fires, bending arrows, stripping battlefields of habit. Atlas enforced discipline like a wall. His ranks advanced with a cleanliness even enemies respected. Menoetius carried battle fury like religion, charging to prove courage meant smashing and frenzy spreads when the fearful see someone unafraid. Apate seeded rumors Zeus was a coward, a cave dweller, bloodless. Lies fluttered like cheap birds until Zeus dragged a braggart from his chariot and pressed his pride into mud. Yet Titanomachy was not decided by who was stronger. It was decided by who could maintain structure longer under exhaustion. Cronus ruled by freezing. His war mirrored that rhythm, seeking one blow to erase all others. One final day. Zeus learned another rhythm, not forcing the world to hold shape, but letting it live in deformation without breaking. Days followed days. Seasons followed seasons. Front lines shifted like cracks changing direction. Wounds moved across bodies. Questions changed tone no longer. When will we win? But who will still be standing when the other is tired? At times, old bonds surfaced. Themis and Mnemosyne once entered Titan camps under a plain white flag. No symbols, no markings. No one touched them. Even tyranny glances over its shoulder when law and memory enter a tent. They asked Cronus to stop. He spoke of beating dogs into place. They left without drinking what was offered, for some invitations in war are only tests of who can still be bought. Zeus learned Prometheus and Epimetheus would not fight their mother's kin, nor raise swords for an order that devoured its children. Zeus nodded and spoke a long shadowed line the coming age would need builders more than generals. The war did not end, but a shape began forming. As with all long wars, Titanomachy reached a point where strength could no longer break stalemate. Two storms colliding too long yield dust, not rain. Two forces pulling too long lose elasticity and crack. The world showed fatigue, not human fatigue, but structural small tremors, strange dreams, silences stretching too far. And here the Gaia knot began to form. Gaia had been patient. But patience is not consent. She had seen Uranus fall. Cronus replace one tyranny with another and call it stability. As war stretched until every equation of force looped, Gaia began to move, not with explosive rage, but with the will of Earth, deciding that what has been buried too long must be unearthed. Zeus, who had learned waiting in the cave, heard this fatigue, not with ears, but through dreams. And when he heard it, the war remained. But the path to victory bent downward, away from plains of dust, away from surface clashes, toward the deepest place, a door unopened, since the world learned what a room was. And that is where the next chapter must open exactly as you have locked it. Gaia appears in the dream, pointing Zeus toward Tartarus to free the Cyclopes and the Hecatoncheires. The dream did not arrive like a radiant vision. It came the way the earth shifts beneath your feet, when no one is looking very slight, very deep, and asking no permission to be named. Zeus dreamed of Gaia not in the shape of a goddess standing in a forest or on a mountaintop, but in a space where there was no clear boundary between body and strata, where a voice did not travel through air, but spread through weight. There was no light, only the sensation of earth breathing slowly, deeply, evenly, like a being that had lived too long to need to explain its own existence. Gaia did not accuse. She did not urge. She did not stand on any side long enough to become a verdict. She did not say war was wrong, and she did not say Zeus was right. She did not reach for words like justice or guilt, because to her, those words arrive very late in the life of the world, after the damage has already learned its own shape, after the pattern has repeated long enough to feel inevitable, after the question of stopping has become less a choice than a fantasy. Justice, guilt, innocence. These are human tools built for minds that need clean edges. But Gaia was older than edges. She was the place edges were pressed into. Her voice carried no morality. It carried fatigue. A fatigue not theatrical, not pleading, not sharpened into accusation. It did not rise and fall like rhetoric. It had no need to convince. It simply existed, heavy, patient, and undeniable, like the weight beneath every step you have ever taken without noticing. It was the kind of fatigue that cannot be solved by apology because it is not personal. It is structural. It did not show itself as a sigh. It showed itself as a rhythm so slow it almost stopped being speech at all. A rhythm like stone that has held too many seasons without ever being asked whether it wished to keep holding. A rhythm like land that has grown accustomed to keeping everything upright mountain forest temple throne, while knowing with a knowledge too deep to be called thought that nothing guarantees what stands upon it will know when to stop. The tallest structures always forget the ground. They mistake endurance for agreement. They mistake silence for permission. When Gaia spoke, it did not feel as though she were intervening. It felt only as though she were recording like ground recording footprints, not asking whether the walker is righteous or cruel, not pausing to praise or condemn, only remembering that they passed. And because she remembered, the world remembered. Not as a story, not as a lesson, but as pressure pressed into layers, stored in fault lines, held in the long, quiet tension of things that do not break quickly, but never truly forget. And in that recording there was something more unsettling than anger, the calm certainty of a foundation that has measured every weight placed upon it, and knows exactly how close the structure above has come, again and again, to demanding more than any base can bear forever. She spoke the way a foundation speaks to a structure built too high upon its back. Not in anger, but in a simple truth I have carried long enough. There was no threat, because the foundation does not need to threaten what depends on it. There was no plea either, because the earth does not know how to ask what stands upon it to be gentler. Gaia showed Zeus one thing without explanation. This world had been forced to hold too many opposing forces at once, and endurance, no matter how patient, is not the same as consent. Her voice was weary because she remembered. Not with personal memory, but with accumulated compression. She remembered how Uranus had once pressed the sky down. She remembered how Cronus had frozen the flow. She remembered children forced back into the womb of the earth, not like seeds, but like errors to be hidden. Those memories were not retold as stories. They existed as pressure in stone, as tension in tectonic plates that millions of years later humans would feel as sudden tremors. The world is holding too many forces in places that no longer need them. The dream whispered not in letters, but in a feeling like placing your hand on stone, long cooled, and knowing that heat still remains inside. What is buried too deep does not vanish, it only waits. In that dream, Zeus did not see the battlefield. He saw layers of earth stacked upon one another, each layer, a decision left unresolved, a tyranny replaced, but never truly set down. And at the bottom, deeper than roots could ever reach, was a darkness that was not emptiness, but storage, Tartarus. You will not win by striking more, Gaia did not say, but Zeus understood. You will win by opening. When Zeus woke, the war was still there. Wind still carried the scent of iron. The ground still trembled. Yet inside him, a path had been drawn, not sideways, not upward, but downward. He did not call an army. He did not raise a ritual. He did not announce. Because the doors at the bottom of the world do not open for crowds. Zeus chose those who were necessary, not for strength, but for function. Hades went first, not as one who leads by torchlight, but as one accustomed to moving in spaces where light is excess. To Hades, Tartarus was not fear, but system, a place that must be managed so the world above does not choke on forces left unclassified. Themis went with him, carrying law not to judge, but to give every act a boundary. For opening a door at the bottom of the world is not bravery, it is precision. One wrong step and liberation becomes a broken dam. Mnemosyne walked beside Themis' memory, traveling with law so that what is opened does not slip loose of its name. She carried no list, no carved stone, yet every name ever forgotten lived in her, waiting to be spoken again at the right time in the right voice, so it would not become chaos. Metis came last, not because she lagged, but because she watched everything no one said. Metis' cunning was not trickery, but the ability to see where paths overlap and choose the point that costs the least force. She knew Tartarus could not be opened by violence, because violence was the reason it had to exist. The descent was not steep in a physical sense. It was steep in an existential sense. With each step downward, familiar concepts thinned, time fell out of rhythm space, lost direction, and the idea of up and down stopped being useful. They did not pass through terrain. They passed through the depth of old decisions. At the gate of Tartarus, Campe waited, not a monster in any crude sense. Campe was the crystallization of the function of guarding her body, shaped from what is made to prevent intermingling, coiling serpents, hard scales, eyes that did not blink. She did not ask. She did not threaten. Her presence alone was enough to make any ordinary being turn back. Zeus did not step forward first. He stayed. Because in moments like these, stepping forward is often the wrong rhythm. Themis was the first to act, not with command, but with placement. She named Campe's boundary, reminding her that the task of a guardian is to keep the gate closed to what does not belong, not to what must be returned to its proper place. Themis's words did not make Campe retreat, but they made her slow. In that slowing, Mnemosyne lifted her voice, calling the names of those imprisoned, not as a plea for rescue, but as their primordial memory, the first forging rhythms, the first stone throws, the first acts of holding the world when it was still soft. Those names did not break the chains, but they made the chains remember why they had been made. Metis moved through the empty space those two forces created. She did not strike. She did not break. She bent direction. She found the junction between Campe's duty and Campe's fear, then pushed just enough for Campe to turn by her own reflex, guarding another direction, opening a gap no one would call a gap unless they knew how to see. Hades stepped through that gap like a punctuation mark, placed exactly where it belongs, not fast, not slow. And when he touched the chain did not cry out. It only grew heavier, heavy enough that it could no longer keep its old shape. The gate of Tartarus opened, not with sound, but with fit. No hinges shrieked, no stone shattered, no roar of a world being torn. only a moment difficult to grasp when forces that had opposed one another suddenly stood in their correct positions, like the final gears locking after a long time slipping. When the right force, the right rhythm, the right function touched one another, the world did not need to resist because nothing was being forced to act against its nature anymore. In that moment, Tartarus was no longer an abyss, but a threshold. A boundary opened, not to destroy it, but to adjust a flow that had been clogged too long. The pressure gathered in the earth did not explode or erupt. It quietly rerouted like water, finally finding a crack just wide enough to pass without breaking the levee. The Cyclopes stepped out first, not with the gait of freed prisoners, but with the tempo of workers returning to unfinished labor. Their gaze did not blaze. It was deep and narrow, like a smith's eyes when metal has reached the exact temperature too hot, and it burns too cold, and it breaks. It was the gaze of concentration honed through ages of abandonment, where every movement must be right because one wrong beat costs your own hands. The Cyclops' hands carried the memory of hot metal, not memory in words, but in sensation. The slight vibration traveling back from hammer to wooden haft, the feel of an axe edge meeting a surface that is finally softening the feel of the moment you must stop before the material pushes back. Those hands did not search for enemies. They searched for function. They recognized the world as a block of unfinished material that had to be worked again after being stretched beyond its limit. Behind them, the Hecatoncheires emerged not as a flood, but as foundation rising from the earth itself. Their 100 hands did not lift to threaten. They set down one hand at a time, slow, steady, heavy. Each arm touched ground like a support column lowered into the exact place distributing weight instead of crushing it. No wasted movement, no display. Only the presence of force great enough to hold, yet knowing enough not to pulverize what it holds. When the Hecatoncheires stood still, the space around them changed rhythm. Not wider, more stable. The Tartarus gate behind them did not need a lock because their very weight was a vow what has been set back into its proper place will not rise again on its own. Not because it is forbidden, but because it no longer needs to. In that moment, Zeus said nothing. No promise, no command. Before forces like these language becomes excess. He understood like a craftsman who sees his tools returned after years lost, that this was not freedom for fighting, but restoration of role. Tartarus behind them closed not like a wound scabbing over, but like a joint set back into place. The world above did not tremble in celebration. It exhaled very slightly. A long breath no one could hear, yet everyone could feel like an old dull pain finally releasing its demand for constant attention. And in that silence, something new was established. The coming war would no longer be only collision of strength, but a dialogue between force and form, between what can break and what knows how to build. No hammer had risen yet, but the world already knew that from this moment on, it would no longer have to endure pressure blindly. There was no cheering, no proclamation, only a strange sensation the pressure of the upper world had just been redirected to the right place. Zeus looked at them not as a liberator looks at prisoners, but as one who has finally placed a missing piece into a structure that has been skewed too long. He did not promise. He did not demand loyalty. Forces like these do not need oaths. They need the right work. When the company turned away from Tartarus, the door sealed not to imprison, but to reshape the flow. Campe remained still. Her duty was not broken, only recalibrated. And on the surface of the world, the war had not ended. but its rhythm had changed. It was no longer two exhausted storms colliding without limit. Somewhere deep beneath the feet of every army, the first hammers began to sound, not the sound of destruction, but the sound of preparation. From that moment, the Titanomachy had an exit. The forge was not constructed. It had existed before the concept of construction itself. It lay deep within the rock, where heat did not come from fire, but from the memory of pressure, where metal that had never been named already knew it would have to endure shape. There was no dome, no dividing walls, only masses of stone that had once been compressed beyond the point of breaking, forced to learn how to transform instead. The Cyclopes entered that space like craftsmen returning to an old workshop after exile. No one spoke words of reunion. No one raised a hand in celebration. They placed their hands on the stone, on the anvil, on the bellows, the way a worker lays hands on tools to be sure they still remember him. And the stone older than every rain remembered. Here the Cyclopes were not monsters. They had never been monsters. That was only the name old power assigned to those who created what it could not control. In the deep red light reflected from heated metal, the one-eyed faces showed no savagery. They showed precision, a kind of calm known only to those who understand that one wrong beat, and the world will pay the price. They did not ask Zeus what he wanted. They watched how Zeus stood, how he placed his weight on both feet, how he kept silence before the anvil, how he did not touch what had not yet been offered. And from that they knew what must be done. The thunderbolt, not a weapon, but the right to name. The thunderbolt was not forged like a spear, because it was not born to pierce any single object. It had no blade to cut, no shaft to grip, no hilt to channel force from arm to metal. It did not allow human or God to use it as an extension of muscle. Its shape did not point forward. It existed as a point of tension in space, where every direction could become the direction of impact, but none was privileged before the decision was made. Argus chose a metal that did not exist on the surface of the world, not to create something superior, but because lightning does not belong to the ground. That metal was drawn from layers so deep that pressure had crushed all familiar forms, where matter no longer remembered whether it had once been soft or hard, only that it had endured. Argus did not name the metal. Naming is a form of confinement, and the thunderbolt does not permit confinement. Bronte struck the metal without rhythm, not the steady rhythm of war, nor the triumphant rhythm of victory. He struck in the pauses between beats, the moments most beings ignore, where the hand hesitates, thinking it is not yet time. But it is in those pauses that metal has time to respond, to remember what it was before being forced into rigidity. Each strike was not meant to deform, but to ask, how much pressure can you still bear before losing your nature? Steropes did not work the bellows to heat in the usual way. He controlled airflow to do the opposite, to create thermal differentials so subtle that the metal began to remember what it once was. Not liquid, not solid, but an intermediate state where matter still retains the right to choose its next form. The thunderbolt was not forced to become lightning. It was allowed to become lightning, and thus lightning is not born from fire. Fire is merely its most visible consequence. Lightning is born from difference. The difference between a moment when everything can still remain still, and a moment when remaining still becomes complicity. The difference between silence held in understanding and silence held in fear. The difference between being able to strike because one has strength and knowing when not to strike because a blow at the wrong moment will tear a structure no one can later mend. The thunderbolt is the material form of an irreversible decision. It allows no rehearsal, no pretense. Once called, its consequences spread beyond the reach of the one who calls it, beyond the control of original intent. And for that reason, it never reaches for Zeus's hand. When Zeus touched the thunderbolt, there was no sensation of power flooding in, no heat racing along his arm, no exhilaration of one first grasping a supreme weapon. Instead, he felt a realignment, as when a burden is shifted from the wrong place to the correct joint of the body. A sense that from this moment onward, every decision he made would carry weight no one else could bear in his stead. The thunderbolt did not pull his hand upward. It did not urge him forward. It waited. It waited to be called by its proper name, not the name of a victor, not the title of a sky king, but the name of one who accepts responsibility for the consequences he creates, including those that cannot be undone, forgiven, or blamed on circumstance or fate. The trident, the shape of flow. For Poseidon, the Cyclopes did not create a weapon, because water does not accept being treated as an enemy. They did not seek to subdue the sea with metal, nor force waves into a shape convenient for the hand. What they created was the geometry of water, a language precise enough for the sea to answer, and supple enough that the answer would not become resistance. The three prongs were not meant to stab. They were meant to divide and then reconnect, to divide flow into intelligible directions so pressure would not accumulate to destruction, to reconnect those directions so water would not forget it remained a single body, even while moving in multiple rhythms at once. The prongs were not perfectly symmetrical because water never is. Each carried a slight deviation enough to remind the bearer that no current is identical to another, and no summoning of water ever fully repeats the last. Argus measured length not with tools, but by observing Poseidon's grip, not the grip of a warrior, but of one who had once placed his hand upon the sea before knowing who he would become. The trident's length was chosen, so its weight neither pulled Poseidon forward nor forced him back. It held him at the precise place where a regulator stands between chaos and stillness. Brontes adjusted the weight, incrementally striking metal, until force never outran intent. Too heavy, and water would be coerced. Too light, and water would not answer. The final balance made each movement an invitation, not a command. When Poseidon swung, the trident water was not torn apart. It parted as though understanding there was somewhere it needed to go, and then found its way back on its own. Stair ropes quenched the trident's tips in salt buried beneath the earth, since before the sea knew it was the sea. That salt held no memory of waves, but of primordial pressure of an age when water and stone had not yet separated roles. The metal touched the salt without hissing, without violent steam. It absorbed in silence, relearning the grammar of depth, of heaviness of waters that never see light. When Poseidon held the trident, the sea did not rage. It recognized. It recognized one who did not come to possess. It did not come to stake territory upon its surface. It recognized one who understood that the sea does not need to be ruled. It needs to be regulated at the right moment. The trident did not make Poseidon stronger. It made him hear more clearly, hear tides not only rising and falling, but tiring when held too long. Hear pressure in the deep, where water is so heavy it barely moves. Hear subterranean currents colliding beneath calm surfaces, creating tensions old power never listened to, because they did not immediately become storms. From that moment, Poseidon understood that the sea's power lies not in fury, but in distributing pressure. And the trident in his hand was not a tool to make waves, but a device to know when to let water pass and when to hold it back so the world above would not be swept away by truths it was not yet ready to face. The sea ceased to be a ruled domain. It became a system that was listened to. Hades' helmet, the art of not being seen. For Hades, the Cyclops worked in silence longer. No one asked, no one looked directly. The helmet was not polished because anything polished desires to be seen. It did not reflect because reflection demands a gaze in return. It did not absorb light because absorption is still a form of dialogue with illumination. The helmet did something far harder. It caused light to forget it had ever passed there. No trace, no shadow, no memory. Arges forged metal in darkness, not to conceal the process, but so the metal would not learn the habits of light. Metal shaped under illumination always bears marks of being watched, a faint tension, a reflexive desire to gleam. Arges denied it that habit. Each hammer strike landed in silence, producing no sparks, naming no moment of impact. The metal learned to exist without feedback. Brontes did not strike. He compressed slowly. Layer by layer metal was pressed like a kept promise. No shock, no eruption, only sustained pressure forcing matter to learn how to fold inward without breaking. Under that pressure, metal lost the habit of resistance. It ceased reacting. It accepted form as a natural state. Steropes did not blow air because air carries trace. Instead, he drew air away from the surrounding space, bit by bit, until nothing remained to oscillate. In that void, metal had nothing to reflect, no medium in which to assert itself. It learned to exist in absence, not absence of itself, but absence of all eyes upon it. The helmet took shape, not by addition, but by subtraction. Every surplus layer removed. Every surface that still wished to be recognized ground away. In the end, what remained was no longer an object seeking space in the world, but a shaped void, a defined absence clear enough that the world knew how not to touch it. When Hades put on the helmet, he did not vanish. There was no smoke, no dissolution. The world simply stopped registering him, not because he was hidden, but because surrounding systems no longer had reason to log that presence. Air did not adjust. Light did not bend. Darkness did not deepen. Everything continued as if Hades had never entered the frame, because the helmet taught the world a difficult lesson: some existences do not require attention to have value. This was not the power of invisibility. Invisibility is still a game of sight where the unseen is hunted. This was the power of respected emptiness, an emptiness where absence is not treated as deficiency, an emptiness that allows other structures to stand without constant surveillance, an emptiness where order does not exhaust itself by monitoring every small motion. When Hades removed the helmet, the world did not flinch. It simply received him again, as one receives a number once crossed out, in a ledger, now written back in the proper column. No disruption, no panic, only the sense that a void had fulfilled its function and was no longer needed. From that moment, Hades understood that his strength lay not in making others fear him, but in moving through without leaving aftershocks, in knowing when to be present and when to withdraw, so the larger structure would not collapse under concentrated pressure. The helmet did not turn him into a ghost. It turned him into the guardian of silences, silences without which every kingdom, no matter how brilliant, eventually blinds itself with too much light. Other symbols, uneven power. The Cyclops did not forge only for the three brothers. For Hera, they made a clasp, neither sharp nor heavy, but once fastened, every word spoken nearby was forced to hold its shape. No lies, no ornament. Only what was structurally sound could stand. For Demeter, they forged a sickle not to cut, but to distinguish when to harvest. and when to let the land rest. The blade did not wound the soil. It reminded the bearer that the earth has its own rhythm. For Hestia, they created an ember that never went out. It did not blaze. It did not spread. A warmth small enough to keep people near, durable enough not to require violence for protection. And for Athena, who had not yet stepped into the light, they set aside an unshaped block of metal. They did not forge it. They only placed it aside. Because intelligence does not need form in haste. It needs time. As the forge cooled, no one cheered. No triumph. No song. Because everyone present understood new power is not born from muscle. It is born from correctly made tools. From intelligence that knows its limits. From cooperation where each function stands in its proper place without claiming the center. The Cyclopes did not march with the army. They returned to the forge. Because their task was not victory, but ensuring that when the war ended, the world could still be repaired. And from the depths of the world, those divine technologies began to rise, not as a challenge, but as a very slow promise. That the new order, if it is to exist, will be crafted, not imposed. War did not flare back up like a scream. It returned like the final pressure a structure endures before it is forced to change shape. For many seasons, Titanomachy had existed like two storms, holding just enough distance not to cancel each other out, yet never allowing either side to dissolve. Mountains learned to stand still beneath tension. Rivers learned to run without changing course. The sky learned to keep its gray, as if leaning too far in either direction would tear it open from within. The world had been stretched too long, and everything stretched has a moment when the wheel must turn, even if no one wants to push anymore. That moment arrived not with a horn, but with a very small shift in the way the earth bore weight. Those who had stood long on the battlefield felt at first a sensation like the ground had changed its breathing, as if the foundation had decided it could no longer hold two shapes at once. This was not the earth's betrayal. It was the earth's honesty. And when honesty appears, war can no longer be postponed. The Hecatonchires did not charge forward like rage. They stepped out like a law being named. 100 arms did not swing all at once. They rotated like the rhythms of an ancient machine whose every part knows exactly when its turn arrives. They did not aim for people. They aimed for terrain because in this battle, terrain was what decided who could still stand, not courage, not numbers, not the memory of victories already past. Because when the world is stretched to its limit, it no longer serves the will of either side. It begins to choose the shape that allows it to continue existing. Mountains were uprooted not like objects torn from the earth because the earth did not resist. They left their places like blocks of stone that had endured too long a weight that no longer belonged to them. This was not an act of violence, but a belated release, like a joint finally set back into place. After years of misalignment, the pain does not explode, but spreads slowly, deeply, changing the way the whole body stands upright. When those masses were thrown, there was no shriek tearing the air, no sound of outrage. They flew in a heavy silence, the silence of things so accustomed to pressure, they no longer need to demand attention. In their motion, they carried the memory of thousands of years compressed memory of strata, stacked upon strata of movements so slow that time itself often overlooks them for lacking drama enough to be recorded. When stone fell, there was no booming blast to announce victory, no moment of satisfaction. Only a very strange, hard-to-name feeling that the ground had just been rewritten, not with words, but with structure. New valleys appeared, not like wounds, but like late answers to questions the old terrain could no longer answer. Slopes snapped and did not scream because they no longer had the task of holding the former shape. Stone fell like rain, but not in chaos. Each trajectory had purpose, not because someone controlled every rock, but because weight finds its own path. The rocks did not seek lives, they sought position. And once they found it, they stopped without checking whether formations or roads had once existed beneath. In this battle, stone did not distinguish friend from foe. It only distinguished what could still stand from what could not. The Titans' advance lines were broken not by blood, but by the disappearance of places to stand. Ranks that had once been straight as blades moving with discipline without a single misstep were forced to face a reality no training could prepare, for the ground no longer held its shape to let them pass. The warriors did not panic. They kept formation, kept obeying, kept believing in the structure that had forged them across ages. But that structure, for the first time, was no longer compatible with the world beneath it. Formations once impenetrable were forced to split, not from fear, but because terrain no longer allowed old discipline to exist. When the earth constantly changed elevation, when deep fissures opened between footsteps, when mountainsides slid under the weight of perfect ranks, discipline ceased to be an advantage. It became a burden. Orders that had been precise in a stable world now arrived too late or too early, compared to reality which was changing with every breath. And in that distortion, one truth appeared with brutal clarity. Not every order collapses because it is defeated. Some orders collapse because the world they depend on has changed shape, and they never learned to change with it. Terrain in this battle did not take a side. It simply refused to keep pretending it could support a form no longer suited to existence. That was the moment many Titans, those who had never doubted their strength, felt for the first time an unease that came not from an enemy, but from the foundation itself. Not because they had grown weaker, but because the world had stopped cooperating. And when the world stops cooperating, no army, no matter how disciplined, can keep its shape. War at that moment ceased to be a contest between individuals. It became a rearrangement of space where whoever can stand continues to exist, and whoever cannot stand, even if strong, even if right, even if once victorious, must leave the center of the story. Atlas saw it first, and for the first time, the one who understood the structure of order recognized that this order was being written in a new language, one where power no longer lay in holding shape unchanged, but in adapting before it was too late. Zeus did not step to the highest point. He stood at the junction where every force had to pass. When the thunderbolt was called, it did not fall like a sentence already written. It tore, yet not to destroy, but to expose what had been held closed too long. The sky did not break along a clean, straight line. It ripped like fabric stretched across ages, and the tear ran precisely along old fractures that the frozen order had created, and then covered with silence. Lightning did not seek the ground to punish it. It skimmed through space like a tailor's blade, cutting open so it could be stitched anew. Each flare was not merely light, but a taut thread binding the sky into a new shape where the pieces of space were forced to learn how to join under different rules, no longer obeying borders grown obsolete. The earth did not burn. It breathed. No ash. Only the feeling that pressure above had just been redistributed, like a joint long misset, finally aligned correctly. Lightning did not blind those who looked up. It forced them to see clearly not the light itself, but the truth that the sky had stopped siding with frozen power. And from that moment, no order could invoke eternity as an excuse to refuse change again. With each calling of lightning, Zeus paused for a beat. Not from hesitation, but from knowing that calling too quickly is the act of one who cannot bear consequence. The thunderbolt waited for him, as it had been forged to wait. And within that waiting, every decision was balanced between what could be done and what should be done. Cronus stepped forward, not like a panicked man, nor like a king driven to a wall. He stepped with the gait of an old age, walking itself toward its ending, unhurried, unavoiding, carrying the full weight of what had once been right in the past, but no longer had footing in the present. That was not the gait of despair. It was the gait of one who knew he was the final answer to the very question he had once posed to the world. The sickle in his hand was still sharp, not chipped, not dulled. That metal had never betrayed him. It still carried within it the memory of cutting Uranus, the memory of the moment sky was severed from earth of power, born through violence and immediately called necessary. When Cronus held the sickle, it was not merely his hand holding a weapon. An entire ancient chain of argument was being gripped tight. That order can only be born by a cut, that chaos only yields to metal, that the future, if not controlled early, will return to swallow the one who birthed it. Each of Cronus's steps made the ground hitch, not from fear, but from habit. Habit of stopping. Habit of waiting for decisions to fall from above. The world had once learned to stand still when he passed the way a body learns to hold its breath before a pain too familiar to be called surprise. Stone did not break. Earth did not sink. But everything beneath tensed, as if preparing to receive another command it was too exhausted to resist. Cronus did not look around for allies. He did not need to. He carried within himself the entire memory of an era that had run smoothly under fear. He knew exactly what he was to this world, the keeper of the promise that nothing would change, even if the cost was strangling every possibility before it could take shape. He did not confuse that with evil. In his logic, it was responsibility, a responsibility so heavy that only those willing to be cruel dare to bear it. When Cronus stood in the battlefield, torn open again by stone and lightning, he did not feel out of place. He felt correctly placed, like a symbol summoned one last time to complete its own cycle. The sickle trembled faintly in his hand, not from fear, but from recognizing that this time it no longer faced sky or Earth Mother. It faced something far harder to cut a future that no longer accepted being shaped by fear. In that moment, Cronus was neither villain nor victim. He was the legacy of a method of rule, a method that believed, if you do not suffocate from the beginning, everything will exceed control. And because he stepped forward with that full consistency, the confrontation became unavoidable, not between father and son, but between two principles that could no longer coexist. The world fell silent when Cronus stopped, not in reverence, but to listen whether this time the old order still had anything new to say, or whether all it had left was the echo of footsteps repeated too many times. The confrontation did not begin with words. Those who still hoped for dialogue had died long ago in this war. Cronus struck first. The sickle drew an arc wide enough to cut an entire mountainside if the mountainside dared stand there. The air screamed. Pressure collapsed inward, as if the whole past were trying to protect itself with one final blow. Zeus did not block. He avoided, not with speed, but with timing. The sickle passed through the emptiness Zeus had left before the strike became irreversible. And in that instant, Cronus understood, not by thought, but by reflex, that the opponent before him no longer played by his laws. The duel did not last long, but long enough for the sky to change color. Not because of power, but because of meaning. Each strike Cronus made was an assertion that the old order must exist, even if the world was tired. Each step Zeus took back was a quiet refusal that not everything once right must be extended without end. Cronus made his final mistake, not because he was weak, but because he was faithful to his own symbol. He lifted the sickle high not to strike Zeus, but to make the world remember who had once decided. And in that moment, Zeus called lightning, not at the body, but at the symbol. The thunderbolt did not explode. It separated. The sickle vibrated as if metal, for the first time, realized its memory was too heavy to keep carrying. A crack ran along the blade, not from force, but from inner contradiction, a tool forged to open a way now used to freeze the future. The sickle broke, not into shards, into 3 parts like a cycle completing itself. Cronus looked down at his empty hand. No scream, no curse, only a silence so deep, the kind that arrives when an age realizes it no longer has the instrument by which it can continue to exist. Zeus did not kill Cronus, not for lack of strength and not from hesitation, but because killing is the act of wounded memory, and what Zeus did was the act of an age trying to close. Killing is for revenge, for balancing pain with more pain, for dragging the past a little farther along a road already too heavy. Here what was needed was not a new wound, but a period. An ending decisive enough that the wheel would not roll backward because blood had not yet dried. Chains rose from the earth, not like punishment flung down from the sky, but like something the foundation itself offered. The ground opened very slowly, as if weighing one last time, then lifted metal rings carrying the cold of deep layers that had never known light. Their oath weighs more than weapon, and time is not counted in months or years, but in irreversibility. The Hecaton Kyres stepped forward, not hurried, not angry. Their 100 hands did not tighten in victorious glee. They placed the chains in the proper position, precisely patiently, like setting a support column into the crack of a structure that has borne too much load for too long, not to crush, not to display, only to ensure that collapse, if it still came, would not spread through the world's entire frame. Cronus did not resist, not because he was subdued, but because in that moment a very old truth was finally allowed to sound not in words, but in a silence that did not need denial. He understood what Uranus never understood, and what he himself had once known, and then forgotten when power became too familiar in the hand. An order does not exist because it is strong. It does not exist because it is feared. It exists only as long as the foundation consents to carry it. And when the foundation withdraws, that consent not by rebellion, not by rage, but by simply no longer enduring, then no sickle, even one that once cut the sky, remains sharp enough to keep the old age standing. The chains closed, without noise, no cheering, no coronation. Only a strange feeling spreading through the world, a pressure had been removed from the spine of existence. And for the first time in many ages, time was allowed to continue without having to carry an unhealed cut. The chains tightened without pain. They were final. Because this was not the victory of one person, but the unavoidable turn of the wheel of ages. A wheel held still too long, now finally permitted to turn, not fast, not slow, but at the rhythm the world could still endure. And as Cronus was led away, the sky did not brighten. It became easier to breathe. The war did not end in that moment. but the old age did. War does not end in a single moment. It ends in a decision kept silent. After Titanomachy, the world did not spring up like a crowd that had narrowly escaped death. It settled, not from exhaustion, but because for the first time in a very long while, it was no longer being pulled by opposing forces trying to prove themselves right. Mountains stopped tensing. The sea stopped surging out of rhythm. The air returned to an in-between state, neither celebrating nor on guard, simply existing. There was no holiday, no declaration to inaugurate a new reign. Because Zeus understood what the kings before him had never understood, an order newly born will die young if it is welcomed with excitement. Judgment did not take place on high. There was no stone dais, no crowd to watch. It happened at the edge of light, where the ground was still warm from sealing its final fractures, where the sky still carried faint seams, the traces of having once been torn and stitched back together. Not beautiful, but strong enough to continue. Themis stepped forward, carrying no majesty, only the shape of procedure. She did not stand opposite the Titans the way victors face the defeated. She stood between exactly where law belongs when it has not yet been turned into a tool. There were no questions of guilt, no summons to repent, because what had happened was not a personal mistake, but the fatigue of a structure stretched too long. Themis asked things that did not require spoken answers. What would happen if the old founding violence were still allowed to stand beside the new order? What would sprout if a power that had once swallowed the future were kept on the surface? And what kind of ending could close without leaving seeds for the next cycle? No one answered, because the answer lay in the earth's own silence. Rhea stepped forward, after that not bearing the air of a queen, and not taking the familiar place of the victor's mother, or the defeated man's wife. She stepped forward as the world still breathing memory, one who had passed through too many reigns to know that the most dangerous thing about power is not violence, but the habit of calling itself necessary. She did not ask for pardon, because pardon still preserves the judge's upper hand. She did not demand punishment, because punishment always carries the aftertaste of revenge, and revenge never knows how to stop. Rhea said only one thing very softly, as though unwilling to shake the already weary foundations of existence. Any further yet, her words landed straight in the world's core, where every order, sooner or later, must answer itself. She said that a verdict born of revenge will rot the very foundation it claims to protect, and a victory built upon destruction will force the world to keep carrying weapons in its memory, even after the war has closed. She did not ask for forgetting. She asked for an ending sealed enough so the cycle would not have to return, so history would not be forced to repeat itself simply because no one was brave enough to place a period. Themis nodded, not like one delivering judgment, and not like one agreeing from emotion. It was the nod of law when it recognizes a rare shape of justice, a shape that does not need to shout to stand, because it has clicked into the deepest rhythm of the world's own breath. The escort began, but it did not take the form of a victory procession. There was no metal scraping across stone, no ranks tightened to crowd every step. What happened here was not the display of new power, but the orderly withdrawal of an age that had completed its role. The Hecaton stepped forward. Their 100 hands did not lift high to proclaim triumph. They lowered supported, balanced, slow movements of those who understand weight. Only those who have been buried alive in the earth know how to carry a burden without crushing what lies near them. They did not escort by force. They upheld so collapse would not spread beyond what was necessary. Cronus walked first, not shoved, not resisting. He walked like an old age walking itself to the place it must stop, without resentment, without pleading. Each of his steps no longer made the world flinch from fear, but from habit so deep it had to slow by one beat to realize it had just been permitted to end. Behind him came Hyperion. The light within him settled, not extinguished, simply no longer used to scorch. Coeus walked on carrying calculations that had once governed the cosmos, but now found no plane left to apply them. Crius went like wind held inside a valley, still wind, but without an outlet to sweep everything away. Iapetus carried iron instinct, forced for the first time to look directly at the consequences of that hardness. Menoetius did not scream. War fury finds no one to answer it when silence has become the common landscape. Apate let her gaze slide over emptiness, searching for a fissure in another mind, and found none. Because in that moment, no mind needed to be manipulated anymore. No one needed to be pulled this way or pushed that way. The path had been opened, and the only thing left was to walk it within a silence deep enough that the world would not have to carry one more new fracture. Tartarus opened, but not like a hungry mouth waiting to swallow. It opened like the cold consent of existence, the moment the world, after a very long weighing, decided there are things that must be placed outside the surface current, so that what remains can continue without cracking further. No fire surged up to threaten. No dramatic darkness performed horror. What appeared was a deep, silent depth where light was not driven away, but simply no longer had reason to go on. There, space neither expands nor contracts. It stands still in a very precise state, where every excess movement is absorbed the instant it forms, like an echo falling into soft stone that never answers. Time in Tartarus does not run faster, and it does not slow. It stands exactly where it is, not frozen into stillness, but standing like a marker. So what is set down no longer participates in the rhythm of becoming. Their ambition loses its thrust. Impulse loses its inertia, not because it is suppressed, but because there is no medium left in which it can propagate. The Hecatoncheires brought the Titans down, not throwing, not shoving, not locking in haste. Their 100 hands moved slowly, precisely each hand, placing a point of support like craftsmen shoring up a cracked stone vault, not to display strength, but to ensure that collapse, if it comes, will stop exactly where it must stop. Each gesture carried the memory of pressure, of years forced into the earth, where the smallest misalignment must be paid for by crushing. The Titans were set down not like prisoners, but like masses of force that had completed their function in an old structure. In Tartarus, they were not tortured. They were separated from the current, no longer acting, no longer answered, only existing in a stabilized state so the rest of the world would not have to keep carrying consequence. The Hecatoncheires became wardens not through cruelty, but through understanding weight. Only those once held in darkness know how to hold without turning confinement into torment. They did not watch with suspicious eyes. They watched with steady presence, like pillars that need not move to fulfill their role. When the door of Tartarus closed, there was no feeling of loss, only a deep seal spreading through the world's foundations, the sense that a pocket of pressure had been placed where it belonged, and from then on, the ground above no longer had to strain to support forces that no longer belonged to it. Tartarus is not the bottom of the world. It is where the world learns not to keep dragging what will break it, and within that unjudging silence, the new order gained its first condition for survival, a foundation that had finally stopped carrying what exceeded its own endurance. The oath was spoken beside Styx, but it did not carry the tone of ritual. It did not ring out. It did not need to be heard by a crowd, because true oaths do not seek other ears. they seek weight. And this oath once spoken could not be taken back. Zeus did not swear power. He did not promise to rule, did not promise to win, did not promise to protect by strength. He swore responsibility to face the consequences of every decision, even decisions made in silence. It was not an oath meant to soothe the world. It was an oath that forbade the one who swore it from fleeing himself. Themis set law into the water, not as a fence raised to block passage, but as a current rhythm by which every movement knows when to stop and when to continue. Mnemosyne set memory there not to endlessly rehearse a victory, but to ensure no price is erased from shared remembrance. The hecaton kairos set weight there, the thing every word needs if it does not want to evaporate into hollow symbol. Styx accepted it not like a witness standing outside, but like the cosmos's seal, something that does not need repetition to be binding. Because once it closes, it does not permit reversal. From that moment, Tartarus ceased to be a place that can be named on a map. It became an irreversible state where what has been set down will remain still, not because it is suppressed, but because the world has found a shape stable enough not to need to drag it back. The door closed. No echo, no aftershock. Only a very strange feeling spread through existence. A chapter had been laid down, not torn from the book of time, not needing to be hidden or excused. It lay there, complete with everything that had happened. No one celebrated, no one praised, because all understood that true victory is not the moment an enemy falls, but the moment the world no longer needs to keep fighting in order to exist. And within that silence, the new order, still imperfect, still untested, began to rise very slowly, very cautiously. It did not rely on violence to protect itself. It relied on something far more fragile and therefore far harder to replace: the Foundation's consent to keep carrying it. After the gate of Tartarus closed, the world did not exhale like someone who has narrowly escaped death. It breathed slowly, a cautious breath like someone who has just set down something very heavy and needs time to believe their hands are truly free. There was no answering echo from the deep, no rebound of aftershocks, only an extended hush in which everything began to realize that the war was over, but the consequences were not. The new order did not appear as a finished drawing. It emerged like a habit, learning how to stand again. The mountains still carried cracks not yet sealed. The rivers ran with silt, darker than usual, like memory that had not settled. The sea no longer surged out of rhythm, yet it had not found its old breathing either. The world kept moving, but every motion was careful, as if one hurried step might tear open stitches still wet. Zeus did not proclaim a new age. He understood that any proclamation now would be too early. Power after war easily mistakes itself for painkillers. But Zeus had learned in the cave that easing pain is not the same as healing. So he did not stand at the center. He dispersed responsibility, dispersed voices, dispersed even the world's gaze away from any single point. Themis went first, not to raise new fences of law, but to set the rhythm back in place. Law in the afterwar is not command. It is a sequence of pauses placed where they belong, so every force knows when to continue and when to withdraw. Oaths were not demanded. They were invited because only voluntary oaths are strong enough not to snap at the first trial. Mnemosyne did not allow the war to be retold as a song of victory. She held memory differently. She remembered what was unfinished. The names of the fallen were placed beside the things they never had time to complete. Lands torn apart were recalled not as trophies, but as responsibilities left open. Memory became a map for repair, not a mirror for glory. Demeter stepped into places that had once been trenches. She did not cover the earth to hide the wound. She sowed seed inside the wound, not to forget, but to compel memory to live alongside recovery. The first harvest was not abundant. It was enough to remind that the earth does not need to be stronger to bear fruit. It needs to be treated rightly. Hestia kept the fire low, not brilliant, not calling anyone in. It was a fire that did not seek witnesses. It did not flare to announce survival, did not leap high enough to be mistaken for triumph. The fire of the afterwar was not meant to dazzle or console through intensity. It was meant to last. It warmed by continuity, not by spectacle, by remaining where it was placed night after night, asking only to be tended with care rather than praised. Small hearths appeared across the land unevenly, without plan or proclamation. Not monuments, not centers of power, just circles of warmth that held their shape. They glowed like quiet heartbeats, spaced far enough apart that no single one could pretend to be the center, yet close enough that none stood alone. Around them, people gathered cautiously, at first unsure how to occupy space that was no longer defined by threat. These gatherings were different. Voices were lower. Silences were allowed to stretch without being filled. No one stood to recount the moment of victory, because victory was not what had brought them there. Instead, they spoke of roads taken back in the opposite direction, of houses entered again after too long away, of tools recovered from where they had been buried in haste, of names spoken without fear of summoning another round of loss. They told stories of returning not as a single event, but as a process measured in hesitation and repetition. Returning once was never enough. One returned, then returned again and again, each time, discovering that what had been left behind had shifted slightly out of alignment. Paths were still there, but they bent differently. Fields still lay open, but the soil felt unfamiliar underfoot. Even the air carried a changed weight, as though it remembered being held too tightly for too long. They spoke of returning to land that felt altered, not ruined, not hostile, but subtly estranged. Hills that once offered comfort now demanded caution. Trees that had sheltered childhood games stood unchanged in shape, yet no longer answered to the same expectations. The land had survived, but it had learned something in the surviving, and that knowledge now stood quietly between itself and those who walked upon it. They spoke of returning to people who were not the same. Faces were familiar, but expressions carried new pauses. Words came slower, as if each sentence needed permission to exist. Some reunions were warm and brief. Others were careful, stretched thin by what could not yet be said. Love had not vanished, but it had grown edges, places where touch stopped just short, where memory interrupted presence. No one demanded that these differences be resolved. To return did not mean to restore. It meant to encounter. And they spoke often without realizing it of returning to selves that no longer fit cleanly into the shapes they once occupied. Hands remembered older motions that no longer served. Instincts flinched where no danger stood. Dreams wandered into places daylight could not reach. There was no shame in this, only recognition. The self that left and the self that came back were related, but not identical, and forcing them to merge too quickly would tear something delicate that was still forming. The fire did not judge these stories. It did not hurry them. It did not demand that they be shaped into lessons or lifted into meaning. It simply stayed lit, a steady presence, low and reliable offering just enough warmth that voices could continue without hardening into declarations, without turning memory into doctrine. Around that fire, Silence was allowed to sit beside speech. Tears did not require explanation. Laughter did not need to justify itself. The flame asked only to be fed, not believed in. Poseidon, meanwhile, walked the shoreline listening. He walked where land and water still negotiated their boundaries, hour by hour, where no line held forever, and no claim went uncontested. He listened to the sound of pebbles shifting under retreating waves, to the sigh of foam dissolving back into the body of the sea. He listened for strain rather than noise, for the subtle signs of pressure that preceded collapse. He understood that the shore remembered the war differently than those who had fought upon it. The shore remembered impact, the repetition of force. The places where water had been made to strike the same point again and again, not because it wished to, but because it had been given no other path. And now, freed from that compulsion, the sea did not rush to erase the marks it had left. It adjusted slowly, learning how to touch without striking. In that listening, Poseidon did not assert himself as master of the sea. He acted as its interpreter, standing between motion and restraint, translating the needs of one into terms the other could endure. And just as the people around Hestia's fires learned that return was not reversal, the sea too learned that peace was not stillness. It was movement, redistributed. He did not arrive with spectacle, no banners of foam, no demonstrations of dominion. He did not build higher dikes, did not carve his authority into stone, did not lift the trident as a sign that the sea was once again under command. He had learned that command was not what the water resisted most. What it resisted was deafness. So he listened to pressure, to where waves pressed too long against a single stretch of coast, to where undercurrents collided beneath calm surfaces, storing force that would one day tear upward if left without passage. He listened not only with ears, but with weight, feeling how the sea leaned, how it held itself when no one was watching. Where waves grew too large, he did not suppress them. He divided them. He broke their momentum gently, allowing energy to disperse into smaller movements rather than demanding stillness. Where currents had been trapped by old boundaries, walls built in fear channels closed in the name of control, he opened narrow paths. Not floods, passages. Enough space for movement to resume without tearing the whole system apart. Slowly, the sea learned again how not to be a battlefield. Not because it had become harmless, and not because its depths had forgotten how to rage, but because its rhythms were no longer being forced into silence or excess. Because pressure was being acknowledged before it became violence. Because someone was finally listening for imbalance instead of waiting for catastrophe. And in that regulation, quiet, patient, almost invisible fish returned. They did not return as symbols of blessing or proof of peace. They returned because conditions had shifted just enough, because migration routes reopened, because spawning grounds were no longer disrupted by sudden surges or unnatural stillness. Life resumed not as a reward, but as a response, not because the sea had grown gentler, but because the sea was being heard. And in that listening by fire, kept low by waves, adjusted rather than conquered, the afterward began to take on its true shape, not an ending, but a sustained act of attention. Hades kept space. After war, emptiness is not a lack, it is a condition. There are regions that are not rebuilt at once. There are names that should not be spoken too quickly. Hades understood that if everything is filled in, pain will find another route to erupt. He let silences remain long enough to complete their function. But the new order, no matter how careful, could not erase the pain that remained. It persisted like a very small crackling in quiet nights. The Titans imprisoned no longer acted, yet the memory of how they ruled still imprinted itself on habit. There were communities that still flinched when the wind shifted direction. There were lands that still feared a new season. There were minds that still carried weapons in their dreams. Zeus did not call that betrayal. He called it necessary time. Because no wound heals simply because one side has won. Victory can silence noise, but it cannot persuade flesh to mend on command. A wound heals only when those who carry it agree day after day to move more slowly than instinct demands. Slowly enough for torn tissue to knit without being torn again by haste. Slowly enough for bone to remember its old shape, not as memory alone, but as function. How to bear weight without splintering. How to stand without bracing for the next blow. Time in this sense was not an empty interval to be endured. It was labor. Quiet, repetitive labor, invisible to anyone still searching for climaxes. It required restraint more than strength. The restraint not to declare closure too soon, not to polish scars into symbols, not to mistake survival for wholeness. Zeus understood that what had been damaged by pressure would not recover under spectacle. It would recover under patience. On moonless nights, he returned to the high places not to survey dominion, not to confirm that the world still answered his name, but to listen. He listened for uneven rhythms, a coastline that breathed too shallowly, a mountain that settled with a sound just a fraction too sharp, a silence in a city that lingered longer than it should have. These were not alarms. They were signs of work underway. Fatigue, he knew, was not failure. Fatigue was evidence that a structure was bearing load honestly, without denial, without illusion. The true danger lay elsewhere, not in exhaustion, but in pretending not to feel it, in calling strain strength, in forcing motion where rest was required. Zeus had seen that pattern before, seen it end with collapse disguised as destiny. This time, he chose a harder vigilance to notice where, before it became fracture, to allow pauses without labeling them weakness. And so, the afterword did not close with a symbol. There was no monument raised quickly enough to freeze meaning in stone. No anthem assigned to tell people what they were supposed to feel. Instead, it unfolded as a sequence of days that would never be sung, about days when fields were replanted unevenly, when laws were revised, and revised again, when voices disagreed without immediately reaching for old weapons of certainty. Days when repairs were made, knowing they might fail, and made anyway. In that chain of unheroic days, every small decision carried weight precisely because it was small. There was no hiding behind inevitability. Each choice mattered because it could have been made differently. Each correction accepted imperfection not as a flaw to be erased, but as a condition to be worked with. The new order did not promise eternity. Zeus would not make that claim, knowing what eternity does to systems that believe themselves entitled to it. Instead, the order asked for something far more fragile, and therefore far more demanding to be tested. Tested by time, tested by fatigue, tested by the quiet moments when no enemy remained to justify excess and responsibility could no longer be deferred. And Zeus accepted that test not as a ruler seeking permanence, but as a custodian willing to learn day by day whether what had been built could endure without becoming another weight the world would someday need to set down. If there is any closing line for this chapter, it is not a hymn. It is a whispered reminder that the world, after setting down what was too heavy, must be upheld by consent renewed each day. That justice, if it wishes to stand, must accept moving slower than pride. And that peace, in its most durable shape, always carries the pain that remains not to punish, but to remind that an order can live only if it knows how to listen to the very wounds that made it. When the gates of Tartarus closed, the world did not shatter, nor did it rejoice. It simply exhaled, after long years stretched taut like a drawn string stone, and soil settled back into their places. Rivers found their old courses again, and the sky learned how to stand above the world without a sickle holding it tight. Olympus was raised not as a trophy of war, but as an experiment asking whether power could exist without devouring its own future. The gods divided the world among them. One kept the law, one kept memory, one kept the fire, one kept the earth, one kept the final promises of life. Yet beneath all of this, deeper than victory itself, Gaia remained awake. For justice may be carried out, but a mother's pain does not vanish simply because a sentence has been passed. Somewhere far below, a seed had been planted. Not to destroy the new order, but to remind it that no order is eternal if it forgets the price that brought it into being. If you are listening to this story before sleep, let it end here, as the world once paused after a long fever. And if you wish to share, I would truly like to know what felt closest to you in this story. Cronus's fear, Rhea's patience, or the way Zeus learned to wait before acting. Leave a comment, I read them all. And if you want to continue these journeys from before history had a name, follow the channel. Because Titanomachy has ended, but the world has not. Good night.